Hi bro, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and rate the video in the comments. Enjoy watching. A young guy named Agniel in a bright robe laughed loudly while holding in his hands a long staff with a bright glowing red ball on top of it. Around this ball the staff was in the shape of a crescent. Agniel looked confidently in front of him and shouted, "Fool!" He then shouted that he didn't think he would believe it. While he was shouting this, a short girl named Saya with a large sorceress's cap on her head was pressed against him. There was a smile on her face. The two of them stood on a hill. Next to them was a bald man named Kuso. The three of them looked down where a guy named Light, spreading his arms and legs wide apart, created bright flashes of light. He was surrounded on all sides by many skeletons in tattered robes. Saya, looking in front of her, screamed that she told him. At this moment she turned to Agniel. Then she added that it would be easy with him. Right in front of Light's face there were two skeletons of the dead. Their mouths were wide open. Their eyes were glowing with a bright emerald light. The skeletons were very battered. One of the skeletons was missing half of its ribs. Stretching out his hand right in front of them, the Light shouted, "Holy Light!" A blinding flash of light illuminated the space around him. Agniel, looking down at him, ordered him to take care of everything else. The three of them, with sly smiles on their faces, watched him from a safe distance. They stood on a low rocky hill that separated them from the site of the military clash. Light spread his arms wide and shouted angrily, "Holy Light!" A powerful explosion of bright energy occurred above his head. Crowds of skeletons approached him from all sides. Then he clenched his jaw and bared his teeth and asked to wait. He frowned at them with frowning eyebrows and said that from the very beginning they used him as bait. After that, he shouted again, "Holy Light!" New flashes of light were created by him from his palms. Drops of sweat flowed profusely down his tense face. Saya looked at him with a wide smile on her face and shouted to him that everything was right. After that, she said that he has one of the most ridiculous levels of magic. At that moment, Light, defending himself from blue hostile spirits with long claws, shouted out, "Holy advice!" An explosion of light energy occurred between their bodies. Saya continued her speech by telling him that he was perfect for the undead who loved magic. Kuso, with a slight smile on his face, crossed his fingers in front of him and told him that he was useful to Master Agniel. After that, he informed him that here in the tomb of the King of the Dead he would find his end. At this moment, Light, bending down and spreading his arms to the sides, opening his palms, shouted for the umpteenth time, "Holy Light!" After his commands, volumetric light flashes emanated from his palms. Agniel, leaving the cave along the stairs, said goodbye to him. Then the three of them looked at him with wide smiles. They addressed him by name and called him the owner of light magic. He looked at them in fear while simultaneously casting a spell against the undead that surrounded him. He shouted at them, repeatedly asking them to wait. He then furiously shouted at them to stop. Repeated commands were heard from the cave. "Holy Light!" Light looked ahead with a tense expression on his face, drops of sweat flowing down his face. He thought about the fact that he was literally left to be eaten. He began to remember the events that took place earlier. The tomb of the King of the Dead contains an SS class item, that is, the staff of the King of the Dead. In the middle of the cave, under a large crack at the top, there was a tall granite rectangular stone with a crevice in the middle. On this stone there was a staff glowing scarlet. Not far from this staff on the floor, there were many wooden ancient coffins nailed shut with rusty nails. Agniel, with a calm expression on his face, addressed him and told him not to worry about it. He assured him that they would fight with all their might to protect him. Light thought that this is why he had to get it. He remembered how some time ago he stretched out his hand to the staff lying on the granite slab. He raised this staff and the holders on which the staff had recently been lying began to make mechanical sounds. A moment after this, the wooden coffins began to make creaking sounds. In an instant, many wooden coffins broke into small planks, and furious skeletons began to crawl out of them. Light turned around in fear and looked at them with a questioning gaze. A moment later, a huge figure formed behind him, emerging from a large granite stone on which the staff was held. Behind him stood a tall skeleton with a black cloak and huge beads around his neck. In his forehead between his eyes there was a glowing crack. From his mouth came a bright turquoise color. Light looked ahead in fear, holding the staff in his hands, and suddenly he thought that it was not for nothing that this place was called a tomb. Soon after, he ran away in fear, clutching the staff in both hands and holding it close to him. Agniel, standing on a hill, shouted his name. After that, he extended his hand in front of him and asked him to throw the staff towards him. After that, with a worried expression on his face, he loudly said that he could defeat the Lick with this. Light looked up at him in confusion and then shouted in the affirmative. He called him a master and then threw his staff in his direction. Agniel grabbed it tightly with his hand. Light looked at this in surprise and thought that he had succeeded. He understood that now he was saved. At that moment, Agniel was clutching the staff to himself, and with a gentle smile on his face, he thought that he had finally received it. Light looked at this in confusion, asking himself again. Seiya approached him and cheerfully raised her hands to her chest and screamed that he had done it. Agniel, looking at her with a smile, said that they had nothing to do here now. Light, who was gradually surrounded by skeletons, called out to them and hesitantly asked them to help him quickly. Agniel looked at him coldly and told him that it was a great job. Light's eye widened and his eyebrow rose. He asked him again in bewilderment. Now he was alone in a cave, surrounded by a large number of skeletons and spirits. He tirelessly repeated loudly, "Holy light." A huge number of bright light flashes were formed by him in different directions. He stopped tiredly, lowered his head down. He tried to catch his breath while the figures of a skeleton and a spirit appeared behind him. He shouted furiously, "Holy light." When a bright flash illuminated the space surrounding him, he thought that he was the owner of 6th level light magic. He understood that this was intermediate magic that could only scare away enemies. He remembered how they told him that he had a useless skill. Mentally he confirmed this. He told himself that he could not defeat the undead, because no matter how much experience he accumulated, he understood that light magic did not have any offensive power. While he was thinking about this, several furious skeletons came out of his light flashes completely unharmed. He looked at them with a reddened expression, raising his hands up. Bright points of light formed on his palms from which he formed his spells. He looked at them wearily and thought that everything was clear from the very beginning. He asked himself, how could such a lowly adventurer like him be recruited by the rank, a Silver Will Rising party? He thought about that. However, an image of Seiya appeared in his mind, looking at him with a smile on her face and telling him please. He exhaled hysterically from his lungs. His jaw was very tense and, exposing his teeth, his mouth transformed into a wolfish grin. He thought that if the king of the dead loves magical power, then he is the one who exudes more of it. One of the skeletons with just one glowing eye and facial bones that were all in cracks walked towards him with his mouth wide open. Light spread his arms to the sides and shouted, thereby scaring away the skeletons and spirits, "Holy light." He understood that they knew and were counting on it. Out of anger, he tensed his jaw again and looked ahead from under his brows. He told himself that he was an idiot, after which he began to swear at the situation that happened to him. He remembered the images of Agni, Sai, askance. Mentally, he turned to them and said that maybe they were counting on such an outcome, but they wanted him to be eaten so much that they forgot to ask him about it. Suddenly, with great anguish and pain, he cried out, "Damn it!" At this moment, he stared intently at his tense palm. While blood was dripping from him, he confidently thought that he was not going to stay here because he was alive. He held onto his stomach, from which blood was oozing in copious streams. A pool of blood had already formed on the floor under him. Light stood hunched over, looking in front of him, blood flowing from his mouth. Stretching his hand forward, he began to create magical flashes around himself, and at the same time, the hands of the skeletons crawled out of the ground. He screamed furiously, spitting blood from his mouth. He remembered the images of his allies and told himself that he had not lost yet. After that, he began to raise his trembling hand up. He told himself that he would live. After that, he looked menacingly from under his brows and extended his hand in front of him. At that moment he began to pronounce the command, Saint. He didn't have time to finish because a system table appeared in front of him. on which it was written that an error had occurred in the level of holy magic. He looked at it thoughtfully and asked himself, "Is the status an error?" After that, his hand dropped. He swore and scaredly told himself that this couldn't be, after which he asked in bewilderment, "Is the magic over?" By this moment, a huge crowd of undead stood opposite him. Behind them stood a tall, powerful skeleton that glowed brightly with a turquoise light. The system table notified him that the maximum limit of the light attribute had been reached. The achievement was obtained. He looked at it in surprise. On the table it was written that the evolution of the light attribute had occurred, from the attribute light to the attribute ray of light, after which the question was formulated on the table: does he want to evolve? He looked at it in bewilderment with his eyes wide open and asked, "Evolution?" There are two types of people in this world: those who fight with swords, spears, and other weapons, that is, the so-called warriors. There are also those who use magic to create fire and water, and sometimes heal wounds. These are the so-called magicians. There is also a classification of attributes that are determined by the will of God. 7 years ago, the day of checking the attributes, a tall Gothic building from which came a surprised voice saying that it had the attribute of fire. The young Light, pressing his fist to his chest with a smile on his face, said that the fire is very strong. At that moment he turned to the young Seiya. She shyly folded her hands behind her back and told him that she wished she had the wind, after which she turned to him with a wide smile on her face and thanked him for it. He looked at her embarrassedly with a flushed expression on his face. She then asked him what attribute he thought he had. After that, she clarified, wind, water, or earth. She then suggested that perhaps he would have fire like hers. He looked at her with a smile on his face and said that he didn't know. Then he explained that it was impossible to guess. She answered him by saying that in any case, he was born with a lot of magic and he is the star of their orphanage. Having said this, she spread her arms wide apart and informed him that as soon as they learn to control their power, they will go on an adventure together. With a smile on his face, he confirmed her proposal. A man in religious attire approached him from the side. He called out to them and menacingly told them that if their test was over, they should go home. Seiya waved her hand at him and said that in that case she would go home first. After that, leaving, she wished him good luck. He waved his hand back at her with a gentle smile. Uniform national attribute tests. At the age of 10, everyone is tested for attributes that are determined by the will of their god. Mages have 4 main attributes: fire, water, earth, and wind. However, it is rare for someone to have an attribute that is not included in the category. He thought that Sai had fire, and he hoped that his skill would be useful in future battles because then they could go on an adventure together. Looking at his feet, he thought about Seiya. His thoughts were interrupted by the call of the next one. He shyly walked into the room and looked ahead uncertainly. Opposite him at the pulpit stood a tall man in a magnificent religious costume. The man asked him to come closer. In front of this man on the pulpit, there was an artifact with a multicolored ball inside, which was secured with a metal structure. Light looked in front of him in confusion and then hesitantly walked towards him. The man looked thoughtfully at the ball. This ball began to glow with a bright golden light and emit rays from this. After that, the man said that he had light. Light looked up at him questioningly and then asked him again, "Light?" The man told him okay. After that he invited the next one. Light interrupted him, loudly shouting to him to wait. Then he eagerly asked him if he really had light. He clenched his hands into fists and loudly asked him, "Maybe there was a mistake?" The man with an emotionless expression on his face answered him that God does not make mistakes. Light stubbornly told him that light is a useless skill, after which he asked him, "Isn't it?" As he spoke, tears appeared in his eyes and began to flow down his cheeks. The man frowned and looked at him menacingly, after which he sternly asked him, "Does this mean that he is dissatisfied with the attribute that God has endowed him with?" Light stood clenching his fists, his face completely confused. After that, he emotionally shouted that he wanted to become an adventurer. The man lowered his gaze and told him that with the magic of light, which does not have any offensive power, it is really difficult to be an adventurer. Then he clarified that, however, God still gave him a special attribute, after which he addressed him by name and extended his hand. He came out from behind the pulpit and put his hand on Light's head, telling him to accept his fate with dignity. Large tears flowed from Light's eyes. He turned to the side and walked away. At that moment a call sounded, the next one. He looked at his shaking hands and, turning to God, asked why he needed such a large amount of mana. He thought that he had never been one to have high hopes, but he could have any of the 4 great attributes. He remembered how Seiya cheerfully shouted to him that they would go on adventures together. When he remembered this, streams of tears flowed down his cheeks. He was shaking all over and looked at his feet with a lost look. Putting his hand to his eyes, he thought about Seiya. 7 years later, a knock was heard in the city. A girl dressed in work clothes cheerfully greeted the Light. He is 17 years old and an adventurer. He greeted her with a smile on his face, calling her Melissa. He was still a member of the guild. Melissa asked him if he completed his quest. He answered her in the affirmative and then told her that he was in the cave of demons and exterminated goblins. Then he said that he, as usual, carried backpacks and torches. She spread her arms out to the sides in surprise and asked him what he was saying. After that, she shouted that the party leader was impressed. He looked at her confusedly while she quoted the words of the party leader, who said that he was very attentive and carried as many things as he could. Then she added by saying that he said that it became easier to fight when someone could illuminate path using torches. He grinned and looking at her. At that moment he imagined the stern image of the man who was the leader of the party and thought that he was not one of the verbose, and he was pleased to hear it. And then he leaned on the counter and asked her if there was any new group for him. She thoughtfully told him that she was sorry, and he grinned and told her that it was obvious. He understood that after it turned out that he had the Light attribute. He worked there for a long time as junior staff. He told her that he would go to the A rank canteen. Then he turned around and, waving his hand at her, walked away. She told him okay. He thought that he also had a large amount of magical power, so it wasn't that much of a problem. He understood that he could also use the magic transfer skill to share his magic with others. As he brought food on a tray to the table, he thought that people were laughing at calling him a repository of magic, but this ability also had a practical application. He thought about the fact that everyone in the orphanage moved away from him because of the verification of attributes, including the Sai. Piercing the steak with a fork, he wondered what they were doing now. Having swallowed a piece of meat, he thought with a smile that it was good to be an adventurer after all. He explained this to himself by the fact that all these groups are temporary and pay little, but there are tasks that he can complete on his own, for example, picking lunar flowers. He decided that in his own way he was happy. He concentratedly ate the food from his plate while the other adventurers were having fun discussing something in their groups. Someone looked at him in surprise from behind the glass and asked, "Is this Light? Complete the quest collecting moonflower herb." On a bright moonlit night, walking through the rustling bushes, Light cheerfully raised his hands up and said to himself, offering to start. With a smile on his face, he looked at his palms and shouted, "Light." After the command, his hand glowed. He shouted, and another ball of light. Saying this, he raised his hand up and a voluminous ball of light magical energy appeared. He knew that the moonflower is a valuable medicinal herb that can only be traded in guilds and can only be found at night. Having formed the lighting with the help of his attribute, he lowered his hands into the bushes. After a while, he joyfully exclaimed, "This is it." Between the bushes there was a bright azure flower that blossomed between the bushes. He understood that given the effort involved and the cost of lighting for the average adventurer, it was too labor-intensive and not very profitable. However, laughing, he said that magic simplifies everything. Holding a flower in his hand, he cheerfully shouted that he had no expenses for this. He knew that this quest was only suitable for him. After that, he again began to walk between the bushes. After a while, looking at the huge bag filled to the brim with moonflowers, he said that perhaps that was all. Smiling, he said that this was a big catch, even very big. Suddenly, a system table appeared in front of him, and when he saw this, he shouted that the level of magic had increased. Joyfully looking at this, he suggested that perhaps some new one had appeared. He saw that on the system table the inscription said that his attack power was 0. After reading this, the smile on his face instantly disappeared, after which he perplexedly put his head on the back of his head and grinned and said that he knew it. At the moment, his magic level was 10, his light attribute was level 9. He thought about the fact that the level of light magic, which is said to be unsuccessful, he raised it so high. Looking at the system table, he was sure that he was the only one in this world who had achieved such a result. After that, he confidently clenched his palm into a fist and, looking in front of him, thought that if he reached the highest level, offensive magic would become available to him. He even had a glimmer of hope and bet on it. After that, he closed his eyes, thinking that the higher the attribute level, the more magic appears. He believed that his magical power would eventually increase. Standing in the night forest, he thought about the fact that he had worked so hard to end up at the bottom, after which he confidently told himself that he would still fulfill his role. A memory appeared in his mind of a man in religious robes placing his hand on his head and telling him to accept his fate. Remembering this, a slight smile appeared on his face, and he said to himself, "Well, no." After that, he looked hopefully into the sky and said that he would continue to walk the path of adventure. Sometime later, in the city near the guild building, he walked into the door holding a bag in his hands. He wished Melis good morning. She turned her head in his direction in surprise and shouted, "Light." After that, she shouted that she had good news. Then she clarified that these are very good. He looked at her in surprise and asked what. Immediately after that, with a lightning movement of her hand, she placed a piece of paper on his face. In bewilderment, Light asked her what the... After that, he picked up the sheet and began to read it. Melissa explained to him that this was a request to replenish the group. She shouted that this was from the Silver Wool Party with an A rating. He looked in front of him in shock and then asked her in furious bewilderment, "What?" Then he asked her again, "Him?" He asked her, "From the Silver Will?" She answered affirmatively to all the questions he asked. He was well aware that this was very rare for a group with an A rating. While he was thinking about it, he held a piece of paper with his hands shaking with excitement. The ranks of adventurers were located in a hierarchical pyramid. At the very bottom there were adventurers of rank E, above which rank D was light. Then came the adventurers of rank C and then B. Almost at the very top was the A rank. The S rank was an urban legend and was the very top of this pyramid. That is, the smallest and rarest group. He knew that there were only a small number of A ranks and they were considered the true elite. All adventurers knew them. He looked at the piece of paper in bewilderment and asked himself, "Is the Silver Will taking him?" After that, he asked Melis if it was possible that they were mistaken. He explained that he had just taken D rank. With a smile on her face, she raised her index finger up and answered him negatively, after which she explained that they had seen the promotion letter that they had recently sent to the capital and asked them to help. She told him that as far as she remembers, they need support staff with high magical power. He looked at her thoughtfully and repeated, "Magical power." He said in surprise, "So that's what it's all about." He realized that it could be used as a magical reservoir. He heard that there was a great sage in the Silver Will. He understood that if this was so, then no matter how much magical power he had, it would not be enough. Melissa asked him with a happy expression, "Has his efforts finally been recognized?" He looked ahead in confusion, thinking that with his light attribute, he is confident enough in his magical power. However, he is a rank D who cannot defeat even one weak demon. He said thoughtfully, "That's how?" Melissa cheerfully answered him, "Exactly like that." Looking at the paper, he worriedly asked himself, will he be able to keep up with the A rank team? Melissa, seeing his concern, turned to him and said that he was the best in their guild both in terms of survival rate and in terms of quest completion. She informed him that his contribution to the development of the guild was also high. With a smile on her face, she said that was why they offered this request to him. He looked at her with a serious expression on his face and thought about what if they had a rank. He understood that in this case their path would lie in high-level dungeons, and he would not even come close to them. While they were talking, the door to the guild opened. Light turned to the Melissa. At this time, the men looked in fascination at the adventurer who had just entered the guild in a revealing, tight-fitting costume. Light thought that it was too risky to rush into a good offer. He asked Melis to cancel this request. He didn't have time to finish speaking because he was sharply asked from behind how to cancel. He turned back in surprise and Saya cheerfully jumped on him, shouting to him that he would go with her. He looked at her in fear and bewilderment, asking who she was. At that moment, she hugged him tightly against his body. After he asked the question, she stood opposite him in bewilderment. Tears appeared in her eyes and she asked him, has he already forgotten about her? After that, she shouted in disappointment. Well, Light asked her again in bewilderment while she screamed about what happened after everything that happened between them. He turned to Melissa in fear and told her that this was not what she was thinking about. At this moment, he asked himself in shock, what was happening? Light was scared and shocked when Saya hugged him, burying her face in his chest. Confusedly asking her to wait, Light, who did not recognize Sai, asked who she was. Saya, pulling away, grinned and, leaning forward a little, said that she was joking. In her opinion, Light had not changed at all. However, despite the fact that Saya said these words, Light continued to stand, looking at her in bewilderment. As if not noticing this, she continued to smile, constantly looking at Light, and finally he, opening his eyes wider, remembered Sai as he knew her in childhood. Finally realizing who was standing in front of him, Light asked in shock if it was really her. Saya confirmed this, and Light remembered that the last time he saw her smile was before the attribute test. Saya left the orphanage earlier, completely alienating herself from it, and 5 years have passed since then. Distracting Light from his thoughts, Saya exclaimed that she was very pleased to finally meet him. Light, smiling, agreed with this, and then asked what Saya was doing here. At that moment, Agniel came closer, announcing that they had come for their request. Hearing someone else's voice, Light froze in shock, looking at Agniel. Saya also turned around, but, unlike Light, smiled, not surprised by Agniel's appearance. Agniel, meanwhile, speaking directly to Light, admitted that he was pleased to meet you and introduced himself, calling his title as Team Leader Silver Will. Having said this, Agniel closed his eyes and smiled friendly, and Light, hearing his name, simply stood there, not knowing how else to react to what he heard. Light knew that Agniel was the owner of the most advanced laboratory in the capital, called the Magic Tower. He had the highest rank among those who gathered there, and Agniel also held the title of Archmage, which was the most prestigious of titles. Because of this, Agniel was called a great sage, and reproducing this in her thoughts only made Light become more confused and ask, "Is it really Mr. Agniel?" Agniel, having heard such an appeal, laughed and asked Light to simply call him Agni, since this is not so unimportant. Light froze in shock again, trying to answer something, but could not connect his thoughts together and say at least something. They had different statuses, different ranks, but Agniel, like Light, was the owner of a rare attribute. The Agniel attribute appeared once every million years and was called the Attribute of Nothing. This made it possible to master all types of magic, namely, the magic of fire, wind, earth, and water. But this had to be paid for, since the increase in the level of magic was extremely slow. However, even if the level increases, the magical power gained is very small, and even after spending a lifetime, one may never reach the level of an ordinary wizard. Many adventurers abandoned the Nothing attribute, giving up, since this attribute, like the Light attribute, was also unsuccessful. However, Agniel did not give up, entered the Magic Tower, and, using the financial resources of his aristocratic origin, created a method for instantly restoring magical power. After this, his attribute acquired a new meaning, and Agniel became the owner of all attributes. Light suddenly remembered how one day, when it seemed to him that his heart would soon explode from injustice, he heard how people on the street he passed, reading the newspaper they were holding in their hands, noted that Agniel was amazing. After hearing Agniel's story, and also learning what he was able to do, Light smiled happily and really wanted to meet Agniel. Currently distracted from his thoughts, he shook his head, shouting that he could not call Agniel in the way he suggested. This really made Light feel awkward, and he nervously waved his hands, trying to confirm his recently spoken words. Agniel did not insist that Light call him by a shortened version of his name, but asked that he at least not call him master. Without waiting for an answer from Light, he continued the conversation and asked if Light agreed. Light calmed down and froze, not understanding what Agniel was talking about. Instead, Seiya answered, who, clinging to Light's hand, exclaimed that they were talking about an invitation to the group. Light, saying Sai's name in shock, asked her to wait and asked if she really wanted to say that she and Agniel were in the same group. Seiya, smiling proudly, exclaimed that this was indeed the case, and pulled with her hand the thin chain hanging around her neck, taking out from the opening between her breasts an amulet on which her ranko was written. She had a very high rating, but Light paid more attention noticed that a ranka token was falling out of Sai's chest. He could not contain his emotions, but Seiya did not pay attention to this and, suddenly embarrassed, said that it was thanks to Agniel. These words made Light calm down and look carefully at Sai. At the same moment, Agniel refused what she said, as he was sure that it happened thanks to her. Seiya did not answer, but simply raised her palm up, and Agniel, smiling, took her hand in his. Watching them, Light now understood everything, and mentally noted that Seiya was already in another group, and there was no place for him there. Remembering the moment from childhood when Seiya, as a little girl, joyfully shouted out the name Light, at the moment he closed his eyes, resigning himself to what was happening, since he understood that nothing could be done. He couldn't believe that he wanted to be close to Seiya, but he was distracted from his thoughts because he heard someone say that they had not seen each other for a long time. Kuso, approaching Light from behind, put his hand on his shoulder and seriously announced that he saw his broken heart. Light, who had not expected such a sudden appearance, pulled aside, turning towards Kuso, and cried out in surprise, asking why he appeared so suddenly. He didn't understand what Kuso was doing here, and Kuso announced that it was simple, explaining that he was also a member of the Silver Wool group. These words greatly amazed Light, and Seiya, confirming what Kuso had said that he left the orphanage and returned to the path of the adventurer. He had an attribute called Holy, and so Kuso helped Agniel with restoration magic. Light still found it difficult to comprehend all the information he had learned, and he continued to look at Kuso in bewilderment, remembering how at that moment, when Light himself was small and still in the orphanage, Kuso, returning above him, sternly called him a loser with weak skill. At the moment, this memory made Light frown and think that this was strange. The group consisted of 2 people whom Light had once known, as well as a great sage. But he could not continue to ponder this as Kuso, drawing his attention to himself, asked if he would accept their request. He noted that they needed him, and Light, lowering his head, realized that alarm bells were ringing in the back of his mind. He was sure that it was better to refuse, but he was again distracted, asking him to agree, since Light's help was very necessary. Eyes wide, Light looked at Seiya, who, pressing her palms together, asked if he remembered their old promise. Walking closer to Light, she grabbed the hem of his clothes with one of her hands, and Light remembered that this happened at the moment when they were together before the test. Then Seiya looked at him, smiling, and they decided that they would go traveling together. These memories caused Light to give up his excitement, and he agreed, announcing that he accepted their request. A little later, in the tomb of the King of the Dead, Light, Seiya, Agniel, and Kuso made their way through a dark cave. Light was very frightened by his surroundings and, covered in sweat, asked himself, "What is this frightening feeling?" He knew that D rank should not come here, and in order to somehow cope with his horror, he squeezed the straps of his backpack with his hands more tightly. Agniel seriously announced that they should move forward, but Light practically did not pay attention to this, thinking only that the difficulty level of the tomb of the King of the Dead was AAA. He didn't understand why he had agreed to go, and the friend overheard Agniel say that they were there because he had deciphered documents that revealed the existence of an artifact. Not everyone understood what Agniel meant when he spoke about the artifact, and therefore asked again, and Agniel, confirming this, explained that this artifact could transform air magic and return it to the owner. In other words, with this artifact, a person would have unlimited magical power, and in this case, there would be no need to worry about running out. These words made Light look at Agniel, who had a magical reservoir hanging on his back, surrounded by a faintly shining aura of light. He realized that Agniel had a large magical reservoir, which, as Light had heard, Agniel had created on his own. Continuing to look at the tank, Light mentally noted that even if Agniel had all the attributes, his original magical power could not be that high. In this case, he assumed that he was no longer needed, realizing that Agniel wanted to gain absolute power. And suddenly, distracting Light from such thoughts, a skeleton jumped out at him, stretching his clawed hands forward. Light screamed and tried to move aside, but even before anything happened, a beam of shining magical energy cut through the air, which destroyed the skeleton. Agniel, who created this attack, asked if Light was okay. He advised him with a smile to stand in the rear, and Light, agreeing with this, ran closer. This group did not have a vanguard of warriors, but the vanguard was represented by Agniel and Seiya, and Kuso was in the rear. Light had to stand in the center and shine. In a normal situation, according to Light, such a formation would be losing. But the situation was not normal, and Seiya, suddenly laughing, activated her magic, promising that all the monsters would burn. Powerful streams of flame began to spread, obeying her command, and attacking the attacking monsters. Agniel was not idle at that moment and, activating Thunder Lightning, destroyed other monsters with this, not letting it get closer. Having finished with one of the attacks, Seiya meanwhile activated a new fire attack, without ceasing to smile confidently. She and Agniel did not stop for a moment and destroyed the approaching skeletons. Light, watching them, froze, his mouth parted in amazement, and could only mentally admire the enormous power that he saw. This was a Ranka group, however, Light doubted something, and, as if predicting his thoughts, Kuso, placing his hand on his shoulder, asked if he really thought that there was no need to hire someone like him. He explained this issue by saying that the team is very strong, and the lighting can be dealt with using high-end magic equipment. Light, again frightened by Kuso's unexpected appearance, ran to the side and at first wanted to say that Kuso's assumption was wrong, but in the end he agreed. Kuso suddenly took out a dimly glowing stone, carefully attached to a small wooden handle, and asked Light to look at it. Light realized that this was magical lighting and began to carefully observe the glowing stone, very surprised when he noticed that it suddenly began to darken and evaporate. Kuzco explained that this dungeon consumes magic, so magical tools can become very rusty. Frowning, Kuso continued to explain, noting that ghostly creatures, of which there are a lot here, specialize in attacks on warriors who do not have magical abilities, and, of course, without magical tools in such a situation, it would be difficult. Besides, physical attacks were almost useless against the undead, and Light understood why his magic was needed here. Kuso confirmed this, and, looking at the shining balls of light created by Light, said that he was thinking about what to do with the lighting that is necessary for a normal attack, and remembered Light's light magic. It was thanks to Light that Seiya and Agniel were able to fight, since Light's light supported them due to the fact that his magic was devoid of vices or sin. Hearing such words, Light smiled and even became a little embarrassed, happy that his light magic was helping the A-rank group. This joy was especially enhanced by the fact that Light understood that his attribute was unsuccessful. Finally, after some time, Agniel announced that they had cleared out most of the undead in the area and suggested they rest. Seiya, coming closer to Agni, pressed herself against his hand and, closing her eyes, said tearfully that she was very tired. Agniel, smiling, thanked Sai for his support, and she, distracted from her sadness, smiled and, closing her eyes, bowed her head, placing it on Agniel's shoulder. Light watched them a little displeasedly, mentally telling them to sit down. But before starting the rest, Kuso offered to heal the others, and, placing his hands in front of him so that his palms were facing up, he activated his magic, and from this a faintly shining magic circle appeared under his feet. Concentrating the energy, Kuso brought his palms closer to each other, forming a shining sphere between them. From this, an aura appeared around Agniel and Sai, healing them. Closing his eyes in concentration, Kuso also decided to use a little restorative magic, just in case. Sharply extending his arms to the sides to spread his magic further, he ordered the wicked to leave, and Agniel, when Kuso finished using magic, said that they had cleared the area of those who could still rise. Light, looking at his palm, invited himself to look at what he could do in such a situation. Closing his eyes to make it easier to concentrate, he activated the shelter, and the magic of light, released from it, spread throughout the surrounding space, forming a circle. Seiya and Agniel screamed in delight and smiled, looking at the shining particles of light in the air, and Light explained that while this magic was in effect, it would be difficult for monsters to get close. Smiling, Agniel admitted that he was glad that Light was here, and Seiya, also smiling, thanked Light, since now she could rest peacefully. Light was glad that he helped Sai, although it was only a little. Taking a break from this topic of conversation, Agniel suddenly declared that this was incredible, noting that he could not believe that Light could maintain high-level magic with such a level of power. Light, awkwardly holding his hair with his hand, said that it was all because of the amount of mana. Agniel was sure that this was wonderful, and mentally noted that it was a great blessing that Light went with them, since he was Agniel's sacrificial lamb. Light, not suspecting that Agniel was thinking about something like that, smiled contentedly. A little later they lit a fire to cook on it. Without waiting for the food to cook, Seiya fell asleep with her head on the lap of Agniel sitting next to her. Kuso also fell asleep, leaning on the rocks, and Light soon, noticing that the food was ready, poured the dish from the cauldron into a plate and handed it to Agniel. Angeal, having tried it, exclaimed in delight that it was delicious, and noted that Light could cook. Light, closing his eyes, smiled and thanked Agniel for these words, as he was glad that he liked it. Agniel, briefly distracted from eating, put his palm on the head of the sleeping Sai and smiled blissfully. Light became more sad when he noticed this, and then suddenly, in order to escape from his thoughts, he pointed to the device that Agniel was carrying with him and asked if this thing was very heavy. Agniel guessed that you were talking about a magical reservoir, and Light confirmed it. Agniel admitted that it was indeed heavy. However, bending his arm in such a way as to show his biceps, he exclaimed that, despite this, the tank, on the contrary, gave him strength. He laughed, closing his eyes, and Light asked, "Isn't it true that carrying magical power with you is an amazing invention?" Agniel explained that this was simply necessary for him, saying that Light knows how difficult it is to live with the attribute of nothing. Light froze without answering, and Agniel, lowering his head slightly, said that there is a limit to what can be done using the transfer of magic. Magic transfer was the exchange of magic with another person, and it was a universal skill in the wizard system, but the conversion efficiency was low, so the magicians did not necessarily have to possess you who had a large amount of magic. Forcing himself to smile, Agniel admitted that he thought that in Light's case this was not a particularly important thing, and wanted to say something else, but Light, interrupting his words, announced that if this came into use, all its advantages would be lost. Agniel, placing his palm on his tank, asked Light not to worry, as it was not something that could be mass-produced. Such a tank was the only one of its kind, and the fact that it was heavy and bulky was a disadvantage, but Agniel was confident that with this he could go further. Light, not understanding what this meant, asked where Agniel could go. Agniel, raising his head, explained that he could go to greater heights, and Light opened his eyes wide, not realizing that he could answer this. He didn't know what else a young man within a rank and the title of Great Sage could do. As if understanding his thoughts, Agniel said that he wanted an S rank, and Light asked again, thinking about the S rank. Agniel, sadly lowering his head, said that he was the youngest in the family, so all he received from them was the surname. That is why, clenching his hands into fists, he decided that he should become a legend by achieving S rank, and he should do it with his own hands. Shouting out the last words, Agniel frowned decisively, and his gaze became very hard. Light excitedly watched Agniel, who announced that this was why he really needed the staff of the King of the Dead. If he could obtain magical power that could be used without restrictions, his wish would come true. Looking at the gradually dying fire, Agniel added that he would do whatever it takes and grinned terribly. Light was scared when he saw this expression, and a drop of sweat appeared on his cheek, and Agniel suddenly froze, realizing what had happened, and, apologizing to Light, admitted that he had overdone it a little. Light said that there was nothing wrong with this. Some time passed, the fire almost went out, and Agniel, thanking Light for the food, said that they needed to rest a little. Light, without answering, suddenly began to look for something in his backpack, until he finally pulled out a blackened magic stone. He looked at it silently for a while, and then asked if the attribute here would rust even though it was a magical tool. Agniel, smiling, said that this was not so, explaining that it was specially made this way in order to survive this dungeon. Light, with a cry of amazement, admitted that this was an important invention, and Agniel thanked him for it, and after that he admitted that in fact it was his most valuable companion. He smiled mysteriously, and a faint magical aura began to spread from the tank. As they went deeper into the dungeon, the enemies became stronger, and the number of them grew. However, despite the fact that the skeletons were inexorably approaching, Agniel, using lightning arrows, as well as Seiya, activating a fire tornado, got rid of the opponents. Light again admired their strength, mentally noting that they demolished everything in their path. And then they reached the tomb of the King of the Dead. In the tomb there was a slab surrounded by sharp stones, and on this slab on a special stand lay the staff of the King of the Dead. Kyuso, Light, Agniel, and Seiya froze, looking at this excitedly, and Light, sweating from tension, mentally noted that there were a lot of monsters on the way. But there was no one here at all, and only a large number of coffins lay there. Light didn't know what would happen if the monsters all woke up at once, but he was distracted from his thoughts when he heard someone calling out to him. Turning towards the voice, Light showed that he was listening, and Agniel, who called out to him, asked Light not to fall asleep. He also told him to bring him this staff, and Light, asking again in shock, began waving his hands in front of him in horror, refusing it. He tried to explain why he did not agree, but Agniel asked him not to worry, promising that they would do everything possible to protect Light. He smiled confidently so that Light would not doubt his words, and Seiya and Kyuso did the same. After this, Light still agreed, although he continued to feel unsure. And everything was revealed. Light knew that something was wrong, he felt it, but still he went up to the staff of the dead and, with the corners of his lips lowered from tension, he wrapped his palm around the handle and lifted the staff from the stand. At the same moment, a lick suddenly appeared, many times the height of Light. Agniel, seeing this, shouted for Light to throw him the staff, since with this they could win. He frowned desperately, stretching his hand forward, and Light, obeying, did what Agniel asked him to do. The staff thrown by Light flew past the rebel monsters, and Agniel easily caught it, and then laughed, calling Light. He couldn't believe that Light had caught it, and even Seiya, standing nearby, laughed maliciously. They thanked Light for his help, and he froze, eyes wide. Smirking evilly, the entire team announced that the Light attribute was a real misunderstanding. Light mentally noted that he, of course, believed in this, since, given his worthless skill, he was glad that at least someone needed him. He wanted to go on an adventure with a true legend, who he considered Agniel, and Kyuso, who looked down on Light. He wanted to prove his usefulness. And most importantly, remembering how Seiya offered to go on an adventure together, Light mentally noted that he wanted to bring to life a story about a real adventure with her. Distracted from his thoughts, Light heard someone laughing and focused his gaze on Seiya, who, turning to Agniel, reminded him that she had told him that everything would be simple with Light. Those words made Light's jaw drop, screaming Sai's name in anger in his thoughts. Retracting his arms to the sides, he began to activate his light magic to try to somehow push the advancing monsters away from him. He asked if this was how he would die in a place like this. Now Light was like a disposable tool, but he was not going to give up and, screaming, continued to use his magic, activating the holy light. The monsters, frightened by this magic, ran back a little, and Light, taking advantage of this, made a sharp jerk forward, seeing an exit in front of him. He was going to get out of here alive, no matter what the cost, and, finding a gap in the crowd of skeletons, he rushed towards it. As one of the skeletons approached, he frowned resolutely and used holy light to drive it away. Without ceasing to shout the spell, Light ran, thinking, before the magic runs out, he must find a way out. The monsters seemed to never end, and Light realized that if he couldn't maintain the proper level of mana, he would simply be eaten. He clenched his jaw tightly and frowned, focusing on the glow in the dark in his eyes, and continued to use the holy light, turning in different directions so as not to miss the sudden attack. Having cleared the path a little, Light headed towards the exit from the tomb, deciding that he needed to go to this hill, as far as possible from the lick. Frowning confidently, he clenched his jaw, ordering himself to move faster, but blood sprayed into the air and Light stopped, covering his mouth with his hand. He fell to one knee, spitting out blood and breathing heavily. It was a magical deficiency that caused blood to flow not only from Light's mouth, but also from Light's eyes. He could no longer use magic, and in desperation, he dug his fingers into the ground, which was already stained with blood. Asking himself to stop, Light said in a broken voice that he was not ready yet, and, coughing, tried to do at least something with his very trembling hands. He was sure not to give up and ignored the broken capillaries in his eyes, which partially stained the whites of his eyes red. And suddenly Light noticed a magical reservoir ahead and asked himself, "What is it?" At first he didn't even remember what this item was, but suddenly realized that it was Agniel's mana reservoir. Light realized that Agniel had the staff, so he threw away the tank. With the last of his strength, he pulled himself forward and began to move towards the tank, while the flashes of light he had previously created tried to hold back the monsters. Desperately closing his eyes, he crawled forward, begging, as he needed some more mana left in him. He didn't understand how to use the tank and assumed there was a switch. Before he could do anything, his arms suddenly gave way and he fell, trembling. Still, Light forced himself to stand up and was able to reach the tank. As soon as he placed his palm on it, magic began to be released, filling Light and surrounding him with a magical shell. Order, because I felt that magic was filling it to the brim. Even though Light felt it, he suddenly froze and asked why it felt the same as his mana transfer. This feeling was very similar to the transfer of magic, but it was something else. But Light could not think about it further, as he heard a growl behind him and, returning, noticed the monsters breaking through to him. Extending his palm towards it, he activated the holy light, and a bright flash sent the monsters flying back. Another undead took advantage of the fact that Light was distracted and tried to attack him, but he, again using magic, fought off this attack. Cursing, he put the tank on himself and tried to get up, deciding that he needed to get out of here. The stairs were blocked by several skeletons, but Light used his magic to make his way up the steps. The Lick was watching what was happening all this time, and the eyes and mouth of this one gradually glowed more and more brightly. Light suddenly found himself surrounded by a stream of magical energy and looked in bewilderment as his feet left the ground. The use of magic sent Light into the air, unable to get out until the magic eventually released him, throwing him to the ground. Light exhaled painfully, and then laughed doomedly, and the Lick, watching him, was simply silent. Light assumed that he needed to defeat the boss in order to get out of the dungeon. His face was scarred and Light asked what was happening to the entrance. He assumed that it would open after defeating the boss, and realized that even if he managed to get there, he wouldn't be able to get through. The Lick suddenly raised his hand up and began to use magic, screaming, and a ball of magical energy formed next to his palm, which then turned into a magic circle created from patterns. Light had not yet risen from the ground at this point and froze, feeling an oppressive magical atmosphere above him. Shells began to fly out of the resulting circle, and Light screamed, rolling to the side. He barely avoided the blows of these daggers, but one of the blades tore the tank strap, sending it flying to the side. Light only managed to mentally scream, but with a determined frown, he remembered that he was now full of magic. That's why he thought he had a chance, and he stood up and extended both his hands upward, activating the holy light. A fairly large number of glowing spheres of light formed in the air above him, and Light decided that since this was low-level magic, he could shoot as much as he wanted. The Lick lowered its head, frightened by the bright light, and growled, and then moved forward, intending to attack. Light realized that if he could keep the monsters at a distance until he reached him, he could win, but he stopped his thoughts, focusing on the fact that the Lick extended his hand, sending waves of magical attack towards Light. Light did not have time to dodge, and the created magical blade struck, inflicting terrible wounds on his stomach. He froze, covered in sweat from pain, and the Lick smiled triumphantly. However, Light's body suddenly dissolved, which made the Lick freeze in bewilderment. Attacks of sunlight suddenly began to fall on the monsters surrounding the Lick, and Light, jumping up, attracted the Lick's attention and explained that this was light magic, a mirage. He promised that he would finish the Lick and formed a new attack, glaring at his opponent. He, the eternal loser, was about to break through this dungeon and decided to use a surprise attack from the front. Before launching his attack, he shouted for the Lick to receive at close range, and landing on its body, he used Holy Light, sending the attack directly at the Lick. The Lick tried to close his eyes, growling in irritation, and began waving his arms in order to somehow defend himself, but it was pointless. The monster began to fall, and Light thought that it was impossible to defeat using the Light attribute, which has 0 attack power. Despite this, he continued to fight using his ultra-high rate of fire. Activating the Light over and over again, Light noted, given that the undead do not like his light, if he continues at the same pace, then everything will work out. Without ceasing to use the spell, he did not leave the Lick, confident that this would come to an end. Finally, the monster weakened, and its arms fell limply to the floor. Noticing this, Light stopped using the attack, and, when it became dark in the cave again, he took a closer look at the Lick, from whose head a dim light emanated from the fact that there was still some solar magic left in it. And suddenly a system window appeared, and Light panted as he looked at it, seeing that the Light attribute had increased to the 10th level of magic. This was the maximum level, and as soon as Light thought about it, the inscription changed, indicating that meteor shower magic had been acquired. Thinking about the 10th level, Light asked himself, what awaits him? Suddenly, the body of the Lick on which he stood moved, and Light looked at his feet, and then noticed that a huge hand had risen, about to attack him. He didn't understand how it happened, and just stood there, raising his head sharply and opening his mouth slightly. The Lick's hand was inexorably approaching, and Light could not do anything. Finally, the monster stood up, throwing Light off of him, who let out a painful cry as he fell to the ground. Forcing himself to get up, he asked in amazement whether the Lick had already stood up. The Lick was indeed already towering over Light, growling angrily, and this could be heard even by other monsters located a little further away. Realizing his superiority, the Lick suddenly laughed, opening his mouth wide, and Light closed his eyes, putting his hands in front of his face to protect himself from the suddenly rising wind. He noticed that small but pointed stones lying on the ground nearby began to glow faintly, and he calmly cried out, mentally cursing. The stones grew sharply in size, turning into sharp peaks, and Light realized that he needed to dodge. He jumped, struggling to avoid the sharp spikes. Not even all the monsters managed to do this and were left hanging, impaled on the stones. The Lick stood, preparing for battle, and also watching the drops of blood dripping onto the floor. This blood belongs to Light, who, clenching his jaw, grabbed the wounded shoulder of his other hand with the palm of one hand. He trembled violently from pain, and finally understood everything. The Lick watched closely as he heard Light begin to talk, and Light asked if it was true that this was not so easy to defeat. However, he added that the same situation was happening to him and suddenly smiled. When he leveled up, he had magic, and could now use the highest attribute Light magic. Thinking about this, Light created a ball of light that shone so brightly that it illuminated a fairly large area around Light, spreading rays in different directions. The flow of magic was so strong that the stones lying on the ground even trembled slightly, and Light's nails, cracking, began to separate from her fingers. Ignoring this, Light, frowning resolutely, continued to concentrate magical energy, and then announced that the Lick was finished and activated the meteor shower. A large number of solar particles formed in the air and began to fall down, attacking the monsters, and the Lick, who was also hit by the attack, roared. This did not have time to do anything else, since the streams of meteor shower only intensified, illuminating everything around with a blinding light and obscuring everything with it. The monsters tried to escape, but it was impossible to evade the solar attacks. The lick also could not do anything, and Light fell to his knees from powerlessness. He had to spend a lot of mana for one hit. Now he leaned his elbows with his head down, breathing heavily and trying to regain his strength. Finally, some time later, he noticed that the light had disappeared and realized that this was the end of the meteor shower. Raising his head, Light began to look around, not understanding what happened to the lick and undead. There was no sound, and Light, realizing what it meant, assumed he had done it. This realization made Light smile joyfully, as he had finally defeated the enemy with the help of light magic. Delighted with his luck, he began to laugh, but his laughter soon stopped and Light began to tremble. He noticed the extraneous lighting and, looking up, saw the head of a lick right in front of him, as well as the silhouettes of other skeletons that began to appear in the darkness. Light asked himself in shock, were all the monsters still alive? In a trembling voice, he asked for the status to open, and looked at the image that appeared, freezing. A 10th level meteor shower rained down a given area, shining brighter than pitch darkness and burning vision, but had 0 attack power. Amazed, Light asked what this meant. This was the highest magic at the 10th level, the maximum level of it, and understanding all this, as well as looking at the crowd of unharmed monsters, Light laughed. He understood that even at the very end, all this light magic did not help, and raising the upper half of his body to remain sitting on his knees, he raised his head up, laughing hysterically. Light magic was indeed useless until the very end, and seeing Light's despair, the monsters surrounding him also became cheerful. Light said that light was an unfortunate attribute, but gradually his laughter began to subside, and tears appeared in his eyes. Mentally cursing, Light coughed, and then looked at the blood clot that had fallen on his hand. It was black blood, and Light realized that there was no magic. This meant that he would come to an end. However, turning his gaze from his hand to the magical reservoir lying a little to the side, Light froze for a while, thinking, and then decided that he could still fight. Even though his hand was shaking violently, he extended it forward, trying to touch the magic reservoir. He needed magic, but, stopping before touching the tank, Light, eyes wide, noticed a human hand sticking out from under the tank. He was very shocked and looked closely at the hand visible from under the broken area. This made Light freeze, and he asked himself in shock if it was a hand. Looking at the slightly bent fingers, his eyes widened in horror and trembled. Finally, he realized what a portable magic tank was, and suddenly remembered how Agniel, grinning, announced that it was a heavy load. This realization horrified Light, and he screamed, furiously shouting the name Agniel. He called him a name, and then, covering his mouth with his hand, frowned, mentally noting that Agniel did not invent anything. Over and over again in his thoughts, he repeated Agniel's words that this is difficult, and asked himself in bewilderment, how can one say such a thing about a person? Light vomited, and he wiped his mouth with his fist, clenched his jaw tightly, raising himself on his knees to make it easier to tear off pieces from the outer part of the magic tank. He promised that he would now pull out the person inside, noting that in this case this person would be able to get out. Applying quite a lot of force, Light gradually broke off pieces from the magical reservoir, until he finally moved a little to the side, squinting one eye, as he felt that he smelled fish. Peering into the tank he had broken, he saw Yami, who was bent over and unconscious, lying at the bottom of the tank. Looking at her, Light asked in bewilderment, "Is this really a girl?" Yami, even due to the surrounding noise, did not wake up, and simply lay there, her mouth only slightly open to make it easier to breathe. Light frowned, and then, pulling Yami out of the magical reservoir and transferring her to the ground, mentally exclaimed that she was alive. As soon as he touched Yami, magical energy began to be released from her, but Light paid more attention to Yami's blonde hair. Remembering that only living beings can transmit magic, Light became even more convinced that Yami was alive. He still couldn't control his emotions after seeing Yami in the magic tank, so he tightened his shaking hand on her shoulder. He assumed that she was not fed at all to make it easier to carry, and also thought that she was not even allowed to breathe, and also had to constantly release her magic. continuing to sit on his knees and hold Yami in his hands so that her head did not touch the ground. Light looked at the aura surrounding her and mentally noted that even now her magic flowed through him. This made him clench his teeth tighter and then suddenly freeze, realizing something else. He remembered the moment when he touched the magic tank for the first time and realized that even then, even that time when he put the magic tank on himself, Yami was giving him magical energy. If only he had known about this, he would have acted differently. And now, hugging Yami closer to him, he desperately asked her forgiveness for this. Yami didn't react at all, continuing to keep her eyes closed and radiate magical energy. Meanwhile, the skeletons were getting closer, planning to attack Light, who was sitting with his back to it. But Light, not yet distracted by this, asked Yami for forgiveness for the fact that after so much time he was still using her magic. The monsters were getting closer, and Light, finally sensing the approach of this, clenched his teeth, sharply turned towards the skeletons, and activated the holy light. The bright flash of light slightly scared the skeletons away, and Light thought that he was a walking torch, as well as a magical reservoir, remembering that he was often ridiculed for being different from everyone else. However, Agneil did something completely different, and Light cursed as he continued to use magic and look at the unconscious Yami. He was sure that he would never stoop to such a thing, and, turning to Agneil, warned him about this. Light remembered Agneil saying that he would do whatever it took to reach the top. Now he realized that Agneil had been like this from the very beginning, using Light himself as a pawn in order to get the staff. However, to get this, Agneil used a defenseless girl, and at the same time he laughed. Light frowned in anger, shouting that he would not forgive Agneil for this. He quickly rose to his feet and, still holding Yami, activated several new flashes of light to make his way forward. First, he needed to get out of here, and he announced that he was doing this together with Yami. He didn't care what it would cost him, and he once again promised Yami that he would get her out of here. In order to do this, he asked her to lend him some more of her magic, and after that he decided to do something else and, looking straight ahead angrily, said that he would make Agneil pay. Now he was 100% pure rage, and he was ready for further battle. From Yami's body, magical energy began to release stronger, surrounding both her and Light with an aura of light, which gradually spread, forming a wider dome around them. Light frowned, looking at the skeletons standing nearby, and then activated maximum impact and the use of constant activation of holy light. A large number of bright flashes instantly appeared around, holding the skeletons, and Light, looking through the light at this, mentally noted that even with 0 attack power, this was the purest light that had ever been seen, so this should clear the way. He was breathing heavily, but still continued to use magic, and suddenly noticed that a panel appeared announcing that the maximum level of light magic had been reached. Cursing, Light briefly stopped using his magic, and then activated it again until the maximum level of light magic was reached again. The skeletons, irritated by the bright flashes, covered their eyes with their hands, and Light continually repeated the same spell. He was planning to get out of here with Yami, and ignored the mention that the maximum level of light magic had been reached. From the overexertion, blood sprayed out of Light's mouth, but he did not pay attention to it and, frowning resolutely, continued to fight. Yami continued to remain unconscious, and Light continued to walk forward. Time after time he was warned that the maximum level of light magic had been reached, but Light, irritated by this, ordered the system to be silent and asked that in this case it would give him some power to attack. In response to this, the system continued to warn that the limit had been reached. Light, growing increasingly irritated, frowned and ordered it to shut up. And suddenly he froze, covered in sweat, as the pointed end of the Lick's finger pierced his body. Having weakened, Light dropped Yami from his hands, and she fell to the ground next to him, and Light himself remained standing, looking in bewilderment at the finger that had pierced him. Light stood in front of a huge, brightly glowing Lick with a finger pierced into his stomach. The Lick frowned at him with a menacing expression, after which it pulled its finger out of his stomach. In a splash of bright scarlet blood flowed out of Light's stomach. He looked up exhaustedly with a pained expression on his face. He stood staggering near the pit lying on the ground. After that, he looked at her tiredly, seeing her lifeless body. He furiously clenched his jaw with such force that the veins swelled on his face. He stood in a confident position and pressing one of his hands to the wound in his stomach. He extended his other hand in front of him. He laughed furiously, looking from under his brows, saying that he was not going to lose. After that, he told himself that he would live. He extended his hand and light magical energy formed in his palm. He decided that he would live for her. The system table showed a notification that said that the level of light magic, then an error was written on it. He looked at it in surprise and asked, "Is there a status error?" After that, his hands dropped. He fearfully denied it, saying that this couldn't be. After that, he shouted that he had run out of magic. His face showed horror. Opposite him stood a huge army of skeletons led by the Lick. On the system table, it was written that the upper limit of light magic had been reached and the achievement was cancelled. He looked at it in confusion with a questioning look. The following was written on the system table: the evolution of the light attribute. After that, a question was written on the table. Does he want to evolve from light magic to light ray magic? He looked at it in surprise with his eyes wide open and asked again, "Evolution?" He then asked, "A ray of light?" He looked at this table again. After a while, a choice appeared on this, yes or no. With a very tired expression on his face, he thought that he had never heard of the evolution of magic, but he told himself that it was obvious. He reached out to the system table, shouting to himself that he had already decided everything for himself. He then fiercely extended his hand and pressed the affirmative answer. A light flashed in his eyes, and soon after, a bright flash of light illuminated the area around him. He covered his face with a sharp movement of his hand so as not to be blinded by such a bright light. He cursed loudly because it was so bright. An incredible light emanated from the system table. Soon after, he opened one of his eyes and looked at the system table. Looking at this, he cursed and asked, "What happened to his statistics?" On the table, it was written that his level is 15, his name is Light, his occupation is a low-level adventurer, his calling is a wizard, his attributes are light and a light beam. The light beam is new. He also has access to the magic he received, that is, the light of the first level, the light ball of the second level, the mirage of the third level, the explosion of light of the fourth level, the holy light of the fifth level, the light of peace of the sixth level, optical camouflage of the seventh level, the light slit of the eighth level, the 1001 Nights 9th level and 10th level meteorites. It was also written on the table that he had new magic available, such as a first level laser. Then an inscription appeared on the table stating that the evolution of magic, the attribute from light to ray. He looked at this in confusion with a questioning gaze, after which he asked, "Has a beam been added to the light?" With his eyes wide open, he realized that he had new magic. He looked at the inscription informing him that he had a first-level laser. Looking at this, he asked, "What is this?" Then he hesitantly asked, "Laser?" Soon after, sparkling blue magical energy began to appear from the index finger of his hand, and he shouted in surprise, "Warm." After that, bright blue energy began to emanate from his two fingers. With a shocked expression on his face, looking at his hand, he thought that all the magic was collected on the index and middle fingers. It seemed to him that he understood how to use it. He decided that he needed to aim at the enemy with his fingers pointed forward. At this moment, the Lick was looking down at him menacingly. Light, with a serious expression on his face, pointed two of his fingers at him and loudly commanded, "Attack!" Following his command, a voluminous ball of light magical energy formed around his hand. The command appeared on the system table. "Strike!" He yelled furiously, ordering him to attack it. With a battle cry, he sent a beam of magical energy towards his opponent. A bright beam of magical energy aimed straight at the Lick's skull. The Lick looked at this one in bewilderment with his eye sockets wide open. The beam he sent hit the Lick directly in the head. His skull was enveloped in a bright glowing ball of magical energy. The skeletons looked at the events taking place in bewilderment with their jaws wide open. He raised his fingers up and looked at them carefully with his mouth open in surprise. The Lick's head exploded from a powerful explosion caused by the beam. The skeletons watched this in bewilderment, and soon after this the Lick fell backwards at Light's feet. Black magical energy poured out from the place where the lick had its head. Light looked at it in surprise and asked himself, what was it? Then he noticed that where the head of the skull was, a smoldering, scorched hole formed in the wall. He asked himself in surprise, with one blow? Then he noticed that even the stone wall behind the lick had melted like glass from the heat. He saw clots of molten stone flowing down the wall. With a trembling voice, he ordered to open the status. After his order, a bright golden system table appeared in front of his face. He looked at it in surprise and saw that it was written there that magic is a ray of light of the first level. Then it was written that the laser penetrates almost everything. Power adjustable depending on the amount of magical power. Attack power 100,000 to infinity. He asked in surprise, 100,000. He then asked again, is the minimum attack power 100,000? After that, he noticed that before the attack power was 0. Looking at the system table in bewilderment, he asked again with wide open eyes, 100,000. With a big hole in his stomach, he asked in confusion, what? At this moment, furious skeletons and spirits approached him from behind with warlike cries. Light knew that this was a Class A lay dungeon that everyone was afraid of. He thought that the undead were rumored to number thousands of individuals, but this was not for him. He extended the finger of his hand around which a dazzling blue energy formed. He shouted that this was the power he needed so much. With a furious expression on his face, he triumphantly shouted that now these were nothing to him. He then sent a beam of magical energy straight into the crowd of undead. The beam hit the head of one of the skeletons and hit the spirit flying behind it, who screamed in pain. Light shouted that the phantom disappeared with one blow. The head of the skull exploded under the influence of the beam, and the skeleton standing next to it looked in fear at its defeated brother. Light realized that thanks to evolution he had stopped bleeding. He put his hand to his stomach, thinking that the magic had returned to him. He raised his hands up, realizing that of course he was still weak, but for him these were trifles. He looked down at the unconscious Yami lying next to him. He told her thank you for saving him. With a smile on his face, he promised her that he would get them out of here. After that he shouted to himself, go ahead with his beam. Immediately after this, he stood in a fighting stance, directed 2 fingers around which magical energy was formed in front of him and commanded, beam. With a menacing gaze and frowning eyebrows and also with a wide open mouth, he screamed ordering the beam to destroy all of these. The beam that he sent towards the undead began to instantly incinerate their bodies. With a menacing warlike cry, he aimed this beam in the direction of destroying his rivals to atoms. Light screamed loudly. He tore apart the bodies of skeletons, dismantling them bone by bone. After that, in a rage, he gave the command, shoot. Skeleton skulls were cut off from their necks. He commanded again and again with a furious expression on his face, shot. The system table showed him a notification in which it was written that Adventurer Light Hamilton had been raised in level. Along the way, as he beheaded an army of skeletons, he received many notifications, level up, directing the beam in different directions. He thought that if he maintained the power, it would last for a long time. With a wide movement of his hand, he directed the beam to the side, cutting out all the undead surrounding him. With a tense expression on his face while blood flowed from his mouth, he told himself that he would get out of here alive and show her the sky of which she was deprived in this bulky coffin. He looked down at her and remembered the image of Agni who, with an ominous smile, said that this was difficult. When he remembered this, his eyes became bloodshot, and with a wild expression on his face, he burned everyone who surrounded him. Looking at his tense hand from which the beam came, he loudly shouted ordering to wait for him. At this moment, his entire face was covered in abrasions, cuts, and there were bruises under his eyes from a long and grueling battle. He directed his hand with the beam emanating from it upward and loudly shouted the name, Rotten. The beam he directed easily pierced the massive stone ceiling. Agnel, Saya and Kuso were walking through the cave at that moment. Suddenly Agnel turned back in surprise and asked what the hell. At that moment, a ray came out of a high stone cliff and pierced through the entire mountain. The fragments from this scattered in different directions. Light looked above him in surprise, the sunlight falling on his face. He saw how many meters of dense rock were pierced by his beam. Raising his head up, he asked in surprise. Light? At that moment, blood flowed down his incredibly tired face, coming from his nose and mouth. He fell exhausted to the ground. After that, Yami opened her eyes and looked at him. Then she raised her head up towards the sunlight. It wasn't long before the light fired the laser. Agnil, Seiya and Kuso walked through the stone cave. Agnil, with an irritated expression on his face, cursed and shouted, "Curse!" When they walked forward, he thought that because of this darkness he was all on edge and could not relax for a second. After that, he remembered the image of light and asked himself, perhaps it would be useful not only as bait? Skeletons, hiding behind the stones, watch them. After that, these suddenly jumped onto the rot from the back. A few centimeters from him, Kuso was able to stop these by standing between him and these. He shouted, "Expulsion of the undead." When he shouted this, he directed his outstretched arms towards these. The green magical energy began to affect the skeletons. Agnil cursed with a tense expression on his face, after which he pointed his hand towards the skeletons in armor and shouted, "Crushing lightning." After his command, several dazzling lightning bolts began to overtake his opponents. Frightened Sayer ran up to him and grabbed his hand. He ordered her to retreat. After that, he shouted for them to run faster. He understood that this noise from the depths of the tomb was waking up the undead everywhere. Seiya, with her face red from tension, screamed that she couldn't do this anymore. There were large tears in her eyes. He looked down at her menacingly and shouted to her that they were almost there. Some time after this, they stopped in a cave. Agnil said that for now they had gotten rid of these. Seiya stood hunched over next to them and had a hard time recovering her breathing, which had been knocked down after the run. Agnil turned to her and told her to use her magic. He explained this by saying that this was the only way they could. He didn't have time to finish as Sayer raised her head in hysterics and clenched her palms into fists and screamed that she was on the verge. After that, she turned to Agnil and asked him to do something. Then she asked him, can he use light magic? She added that he had everything. After that she asked him, didn't she? He looked at her emotionlessly and silently thought that this was pointless. Soon after, his eyes became bloodshot. He looked down at her with anger, frowning his eyebrows, and rudely thought that she was a stupid animal. He understood that he took her into the group only because of her attack power and appearance, but she doesn't even have a grain of brain. He thought that he would throw her out right now. But you can get a little light from fire magic. He looked at her tear-stained face. She sat on the ground with her legs spread in different directions. He addressed her in a friendly manner, extending his hand. He hugged her from behind, and with a calm expression on his face, told her that if they wanted to get out of there, he needed her light. Then he added that of course he can use his light, but his magical power is still small even though he is a great sage. He looked tenderly straight into my eyes and said that he needed to save his magic for more serious situations. She emotionally asked him why not use the lick staff. Then she opened her mouth wide and said that this is exactly what this is for, after which she asked him, isn't it? He answered her question with a question and asked her, what if this is harmful to him? He explained to her that he needed to study this thoroughly. Looking at her, he said that he would have to endure a little longer, after which he asked her to begin. She looked at him in surprise with tears in her eyes, after which she lowered her gaze down and gave the command, small fire. After that, a small flame formed between her hands, floating in the air. Agnil, looking at it, thought that it was a very bad light and only lasted a couple of minutes. They walked on, and looking in front of him, he asked himself, can he find a replacement for her? He remembered Yami and thought that it seemed like it was too early to get rid of that girl. Then he noticed that you can always find a replacement. The unexpected seething sounds scared them. Agnil asked in surprise, what is this? He, along with the frightened Seiya who took his hand, watched from afar. Kuso came closer and peered into the glowing ground. He shouted with tension that the earth was glowing red. Drops of sweat began to flow down his bald head. He squeezed his eyes with force and shouted that he was hot. At this moment, they all looked at the seething rock in which magma bubbles were forming. Agnil asked in bewilderment, what? After that, he shouted loudly that he no longer understood anything. He looked carefully at how light rays began to appear from the seething magma and shouted in confusion, ordering him to run. Immediately after his command, an incredibly strong beam of glowing blue energy shot upward. The blast wave sent them all flying back several meters. Their clothes began to burn, they screamed in horror with fear and pain. The flames lit up their clothes, which began to smolder right on top of them. Seiya frightenedly held onto her hat and Kuso angrily shouted, "Fire!" Agniel, with a frightened expression on his face, lowered his burning hands into his backpack, shouting, "Water!" Then he shouted, "Hurry up!" When he performed these actions, sweat flowed down his face profusely. Seiya waved her hands randomly and screamed, asking him to do anything. Then she clarified loudly, "The main thing is that it is liquid." In parallel with her words, contents of completely different colors were poured onto them from different vessels. Seiya screamed loudly in disgust. Then she hurriedly moved her hands and shouted that goat milk stinks. Kuso responded by shouting to her that the potions were no better either. Agnel noted that this is better than dying. Soon after, scraps of clothing were on the ground and smoldering, emitting smoke from them. His shoes were burned through and exposed his feet. These three stood with sad faces in clothes torn from the fires. Seiya screamed pitifully that she felt so bad here. Agnel looked at her angrily. At that moment Kuso noticed that it was a hole, after which he asked them if it seemed to him, or was it connected with the tomb. At that moment, the three of them were looking into a huge hole formed in the stone floor. This hole was glowing brightly red. Agnel looked up in surprise and noticed that he was upstairs too. Then they all looked up with their mouths wide open and Agnel said that he could see the sky. He asked confusedly, "Is this lick magic?" After that, he looked down and said that he did not see the light. Seiya asked him if it was true. Kuso squatted down near the hole in the floor and, turning to her, said to give it fire, after which he added that he thought that light would appreciate it. She asked him irritably, what was he talking about? After that, she said that he had been boring and sad since childhood. She put her hand in front of her and said that this attribute of light was just a joke. Agniel turned to her and said that, however, if it was lick magic, then everything was very bad. He, with a confused expression on his face, told her that if it killed light, then they were next. Seiya and Kuso looked at him in fear as he said this. Kuso described the situation as a disaster. Agniel turned sharply to Seiya and ordered her to quickly use fire magic. He stretched out his hands in front of him and with a serious expression on his face told her that he would carry her when the magic ended. With a very frightened expression on her face, she opened her mouth wide and, at the same time, using a fire spell, she told him okay. Immediately after this, a small tongue of flame formed above her outstretched arms. Agniel turned to the side and shouted at them to leave here immediately. Kuso and Seiya ran after him with serious expressions on their faces. The light coming from the hole in the rock fell on Light's face. He opened his eyes and looked above himself in surprise. By this time his torso and arms were bandaged. He was surprised to notice that he was alive. He remembered that, however, he had a mortal wound. He knew that it was very bad. He remembered the moment how he angrily turned to Agni, ordering him to wait for him. Then he remembered that he had fired a laser. He raised his hand above his head and looked at his hand and asked himself, how is he? He noticed that his hands were bandaged with a white bandage. He asked himself in bewilderment, bandage? After that, he raised his hand up, spread his fingers in different directions and shouted, light! A small ball of bright golden light appeared above his head. He got up, screaming in pain, and sat down on the ground, holding himself by his painful chest. He turned to the side and saw his green jacket pierced by the lick's finger. He thought that his clothes were lying to the side. He understood that he was rotten and the others could not return. Then he thought that there was no one else in the group. He asked himself, then who cured him? A sound was heard behind him. He turned sharply and looked there in fear. He saw Yemi standing there with disheveled hair, holding her hands behind her back. He looked at her carefully and thought that she had white skin and hair. He looked at her in surprise and thought that this was the girl he had taken from that tank. She silently looked at him with wide open eyes. After that, she extended her finger up and pointed with her hand at the ball that he formed. She said, "Light." He looked at her confusedly and confirmed it. Then he explained to her with a smile on his face that he could use magic again. After that, he asked her, did she cure him? She looked at him silently. He told her that he understood her, after which he thanked her for saving him. With a wide smile on his face, he thought about the smell of potions and grass. He realized that she cured him with the help of healing items. After that, he thought about the fact that, however, the increase in his muscle mass was noticeable even in the bandages. Looking at his hand in surprise, he asked himself, did the wounds heal because of the increase in the level of the adventurer? The level of the adventurer is related to the physical, so when this increases, strength increases and wounds heal. The magic level increases along with the level of magic proficiency, so with constant use, the level of this increases accordingly. However, the peculiarity of this level increase is that it can only be obtained by killing enemies. For example, warriors often take all the experience for themselves, while healers and other support staff receive only basic experience. Light understood that such basic experience was correspondingly much less, and he was the only one who fought in the boss room, after which he called up the system table and ordered the status to be opened. After that, he looked in front of him in surprise with his eyes wide open. He shouted, "Wow!" He thought that he was level 15, and now he had reached 30. He understood what a victory over the Lick was like. Then he asked himself, isn't this the cardinal rule of adventurers? He then suggested defeating the enemy. He told himself that he could never do this before because he had 0 attack power. But now he looked ahead and thought that they were still in the cave. He looked at the hole in the ceiling and asked himself, did his laser do all this? He was excited about the work he had done using the laser. Yami, who had previously stood motionless and silently sneezed sharply, he cried out in fear and surprise. He then turned to her and asked her if she was okay. He turned to the side and, holding out his hand to his green jacket, asked her to wait a second. He told her that these were not the best clothes. After that, he put his torn jacket on her shoulders and said that, however, she would be much warmer this way. She looked at him in surprise with her eyes wide open and did not say anything to him. He looked at her with a smile and shouted, "Exactly." He introduced himself to her as Light. Along with this, he pointed his finger at himself and asked her what her name was. She silently looked at him with an emotionless expression on her face. He was embarrassed and his face turned red. He thought that if you looked closely, she had a very beautiful face, but he noticed that her obsidian eyes were especially beautiful. She said uncertainly that she was a Yami. He looked at her in surprise and thought enthusiastically that she was answering. He smiled broadly and said, "That's it." After that he said that it was a good name. She looked at him emotionlessly, and he was embarrassed by this. He thought that it seemed that she was not the talkative type, after which he assumed that on the other hand, she had spent so much time in this tank. After that, his face took on a serious look. He furrowed his eyebrows, thinking about Rod again. He imagined the three of them laughing at him, saying that he had weak magic. Then he closed his eyes with tension and thought that not now. He told himself that he needed to hold on. After that, he turned to Yami and invited her to leave from there. He noticed that they could go to his city. She looked at him with her mouth slightly open. He said with a smile on his face that he wanted to get her out of here. After that, she lowered her eyes down. At that moment, he understood that even if they got out, he could not leave her in this state. He understood that then they would need money for the future. He cheerfully shouted to her, "Great." After that, he asked her if she could wait a little longer first. Stretching out the index finger of his hand in front of him, he said that he had several unfinished matters. She looked up at him with her big eyes in surprise. He looked ahead solemnly, clenched his hand into a fist, and shouted that now was the time to collect the drop. He explained that this was for their future with her. Some time later, Yami collected balls of matte green and blue flowers. Some time later, Yami collected matte green and blue balls. Light, who was kneeling next to her, told her that this was the core of the undead. He explained that this was an item that dropped out after defeating it. In his hands he held a fabric bag in which he put these balls. Then, looking at one of these balls, he explained that you can get such a core and other items such as ashes and bones. He clarified that, in principle, undead are quite cheap. After that, he noticed that although all items can be exchanged for money. At that moment, he thought that, be that as it may, Agniel did not pay him money for the quest, and his equipment was destroyed. He drew attention to Yami, who was collecting these cores in her hands. After that, she handed him 4 of these balls in her palms. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she was helping him. After that, he wanted to thank her, but did not have time to finish. He looked at her worried expression with fear. Soon after this, she fell exhausted. He managed to catch her during the fall with his own hands. She lay unconscious on his shoulder. He thought that this was obvious since she had been locked up in that tank for a long time, and even more so it took all her strength. Looking ahead with a tense expression on his face, he thought that she was even able to take off his clothes and treat him. He dressed her in his jacket and laid her on the ground. He asked her to lie here while he collected the drop. He added that there are no more monsters here. After a while, she opened her eyes and looked in front of her in surprise. With a smile on her face, Light asked her not to worry. He promised that he would not leave her. Soon after, he hurriedly ran to the side. Yami pressed her hand to her chest and fell asleep. Light went deep into the cave corridors. He approached the objects scattered on the ground and asked what they were. In front of him on the ground lay several bags and scattered vessels with elixirs. He asked himself, are these the things of Agniel and the others? Then he asked in surprise, did they drop everything and run away? While packing his things, he said that Yami was probably here and took the potion. Then he thought that he needed to look because it was possible that there was something else left. Taking the bag in his hands, he thoughtfully asked himself, clothes? After that, he assumed that it seemed to be from Sai. With a smile on his face, he said that he was wondering if there was anything else that Yami could wear. He looked at the clothes laid out on the ground. In front of him lay several types of very thin underwear and an extravagant blue dress. He looked at it thoughtfully and realized that everything here consisted of some kind of ropes. Then he remembered the simple robe that Yami was wearing. He noticed that she was walking around in something unclear, and he would need to dress her up. Otherwise, she would freeze. He told himself that he was definitely not justified by bringing a girl with him in such a form. He tensely squeezed his head, saying that not only did everyone laugh at him because of the magic of light, but they would also think something incomprehensible. He then imagined the image of Kuso looking ahead with a sly smile. He knew that he was a child lover. He had been known for this since the days of the orphanage, because he especially loved hanging out with girls. Light thoughtfully put his hand to his head, thinking that he usually took them away from the orphanage, after which he asked in fear, was it the same with Sai? He looked down intensely, thinking that if she knew the Holy Father, he asked himself, would she now agree to be a partner in a relationship with Agniel? He understood that these two had always been connected, but at the same time he thought that if this was true, then Koso was selling children from the orphanage, because then he was no less popular. He knew that Agniel treated the Yami as a tool, after which he asked if this meant that he really bought it. He put his hand to his mouth in shock and thought that it was like a living instrument that could be bought from a Kuso. He then furiously clenched his hand into a fist. Having calmed down, he closed his eyes and said to himself no. He thought that first he had to get Yami out of there and get out at any cost. When he thought about this, he held in his hands a fabric bag filled with kernels. He walked, telling himself that he seemed to have collected everything. At that moment he drew attention to something that was on the side of him. He decided to wait and looked at the destroyed granite stone. He thought that this is what they came for. He picked up a glowing emerald stone that emitted small waves of energy and then poured the emerald ash into a glass jar. He said that lick ashes cost a lot of money, not to mention the beneficial properties of it. With a smile on his face, he looked at the jar, which was almost completely filled with emerald ash. After that, he paid attention to the stands for the staff. He asked if there was something there. After that, he opened the stone lid and looked inside in surprise. He noticed that there was some strange piece of fabric inside. He put his hand on it and then pulled it out. In surprise, he asked himself, what is it? After that, he hesitantly suggested, "Rob." Holding this black cloth in his hand, he realized that these were the clothes that the Lick wore. He was interested in this. After some time, inspiration descended on him. He shouted joyfully, "Exactly." After that, he came to the place where the ceiling was pierced by his beam. He looked at the sleeping Yami and shouted out her name. She opened her eyes. He came up to her and apologized for waking her up, after which he told her that it was time for them to go. She rubbed her eyes sleepily. He then showed her the recently found robe with a smile on his face and told her to put it on. In his hands he held a black robe with red elements. She looked at him in surprise, after which he said that he made it from the Lick's clothes. He joyfully shouted that a lot can be said about him, but in terms of needlework he is capable. Soon after, Yami was wearing this robe. She spread her arms to the sides and looked uncertainly in front of her. This robe was clearly not her size and looked unnatural on her. He cheerfully shouted to her, "Yes." After that he added that it suits her. She looked at him in surprise and then began to spin around her axis. He asked her, "Is this how she expresses joy?" He waved his hand at her with a smile on his face and told her okay. After that he addressed her by name. He began to pull his hand towards her face. She looked at it in fear. After he extended his hand to her, ominous images of men appeared in her head who, with a smile in their eyes, extended their hands to her when she was in the box. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut. Light gently placed his hand on her head and stroked it. She looked up at him in amazement, and with a smile on his face he invited her to get out of there. She was very surprised and opened her mouth slightly, after which she smiled widely and cheerfully answered him in the affirmative. They walked forward. He held her on his shoulders and thought that she had fallen asleep. He remembered how he cheerfully told her that the exit was still far away. He turned to her and invited her to climb on his back, after which he shouted to her that everything would be fine. She looked at him thoughtfully. At the moment, she was holding on to him with her arms and legs, and a cloth was tied to his belt, on which she was sitting. He walked with tension because he was carrying a bag on his shoulder. In his hand he had a bag filled to the brim with cannonballs and a Yami was hanging on his back. Go ahead, he thought that even though he said so, it was a little difficult for him. After that he thought that it was still good that he had such skills. He understood that as a porter he was used to such heavy loads, but after that he assumed that he had probably gained too much of everything. After that, he paid attention to Yami's face. Looking at this, he told himself that she was not heavy, and he thought so not because of any special attitude towards her or anything else. Well, he thought that she really was like a feather compared to luggage. He thought that there was not a single child in the orphanage who was so light. After that, an image of the cold expression on the face of Agnel appeared in his mind, which said about her that she was heavy and bulky. Light looked in front of him and said to himself that he understood. He understood that that's why they tried so hard. He chose what was easier. He looked in front of him with fury, frowning his eyebrows, clenching his jaw. He angrily called him a damned vile man. Yami opened her eyes and looked at him in surprise with a questioning look. He turned to her in fear and asked her forgiveness, after which he asked her if he woke her up. In response, she asked him if he was okay. With a smile on his face, he shouted to her that everything was fine. He told her that he might look weak, but he is level 30. He confidently said that he has a lot of strength. After that, he raised his face and asked her to look up. Yami looked up in surprise. The wind was blowing from there, and the air was filled with the smell of the dead and greenery. They walked along a long staircase leading them to the light that signified the exit from the cave. He turned to her and said that they were almost there. Rising to the last step, he left the cave, after which he looked up in surprise and saw snow-white birds flying in the sky. Then he noticed the blue sky, white clouds, and the brightly shining sun. He rejoiced and shouted, "Finally!" After that he laughed loudly. Yami looked at him in surprise. Light, looking at the landscape around him, thought that he was now surrounded by the dazzling sun, the greenery of the forest, and the wind that brings the aroma of grass and earth, as well as the flutter of bird wings. He turned to Yami and invited her to try to get up, after which she carefully climbed off him to the ground. When she touched her foot to the ground, He asked her with a smile on his face if it really felt good. Yami looked at her feet in surprise and said that it was soft, after which she looked down with a smile on her face. He turned to her and asked her if she understood. After that, he explained to her that the world is not only darkness, not just a small box. The world is big, bright, and beautiful. She looked at him with interest with her big eyes. After that, he cheerfully invited her to take a big breath. Light looked at her with enthusiasm and then raised his arms high and spread his legs wide. He shouted loudly, "Home!" Then he shouted again, "Home!" Tears flowed from his eyes. His face was happy. He let out a loud, triumphant scream. She looked at him in surprise. Then she looked at her hands. He turned his confused gaze on her. She clumsily clenched her palms into fists and raised them up, after which she tried to imitate his triumphant scream. He laughed at the sight of this. He understood that ultimately he was alive. Even though he had been deceived, he was almost killed, and Yami was locked in such a tank as a tool. Then he thought about the rot. He promised himself that he would definitely end it. He looked confidently in front of him and, screaming joyfully, realized that they were alive. He told himself that this was true. At that moment he could not possibly know about the malice of these two terrible people, that they were connected with a deeper darkness and, moreover, that a great one was being prepared conspiracy. The houses standing on the city street reflected the sunlight with their tiled roofs. The male adventurers looked in one direction in surprise. Their gazes were turned to Kuso, who, in a burnt robe with a serious expression on his face, was holding the reins of two horses in his hands. He was sitting in the place of the coachman. He looked confidently in front of him. The cart looked rich and was made in orange and red colors. Inside this sat Agnil and Saya in burnt robes. Agnil, frowning, crossed his arms on his chest and sat silently looking at the Sai. Looking at him, she said that the whole city was watching them. With a cold expression on his face, he answered her that there was a naked old man sitting on the reins, after which he asked her what she thought. Why did they pay attention to them? At that moment he mentally cursed and asked himself why everything turned out this way. Suddenly Saya screamed loudly, squeezing her eyes with her palms. In hysterics she shouted that now no one would marry her. Agnil furrowed his eyebrows in irritation and mentally ordered her to shut up. At that moment he considered her a non-entity. He understood that all the supplies were lost in the fire and there was some food in the cart, but they could not go on like this. He turned to Kuso and asked him to find a house somewhere and stay. He explained that it would do. Saya looked at him in surprise and Kuso asked him what he was talking about. Agnil casually answered him that everything was simple. He said that he needed to take money and clothes by robbing the house of someone who seemed amenable. Kuso turned sharply in his direction and shouted to him to wait. He loudly said that this was impossible. Agnil answered him by saying that he knows that this is not the safest area. There are a lot of guards in the city and everywhere, so they definitely shouldn't get caught. After that, he turned to Saya. She asked him in fear, "What?" With a slight smile on his face, he told her that she wanted to take a bath. After that he asked her, "Isn't it?" She confirmed this in confusion, saying that she stinks. Agnil explained by saying that their legendary group is in a difficult situation, so everything is allowed to them. Kuso, after being silent for a while, hesitantly asked him if this was true. Then he said that considering how they were dressed, Agnil looked at him menacingly and ordered him in this case to kill and rob them. Saya looked at him in confusion and was silent in response. Kuso, under great stress, shouted that this couldn't be done. He explained that then their reputation would go downhill. Agnil answered him, "Okay." After that he said that he thought that he would have to return to the guild where they left the money and supplies. Kuso at this moment asked incomprehensibly what he was thinking about. He furrowed his eyebrows and thought that if it came to murder and robbery and he was caught, it would be difficult to conduct business in the future. Agnil closed his eyes with tension and crossed his arms on his chest. He thought that Kuso was against it because he had already committed many crimes. After that, he looked gloomily at his hand and thought that even so he still needed to regain his magical power. He understood that as soon as he received this, he would be able to destroy monsters and sell parts of them. Then he raised his eyes and looked in front of him. He thought about magical power. after which he assumed that Yami was probably already dead. He decided that this was a waste of time. He remembered her image in his mind, her so small and light, and yet he understood that it was rare to find an individual with so much magic. He remembered that training her was a complete frustration. He looked at the staff that was next to him in the cart. Looking at it thoughtfully, he said, "Lick staff." He noticed that there was not a scratch on it, even after such a blow. He reached out and took this staff, after which he thoughtfully asked himself, is it made of some special material? He then suggested maybe there was some kind of curse behind it. Looking at this thoughtfully, he suggested that they would have to return to the capital to find out. He understood that if he could use it, he would need to make another tank. After that, he exhaled heavily from his lungs and realized that they had too many limitations. He needed to be placed inside a person, support his life and carry him on his back. He also understood that, in addition, a person should be light and small, and with all this with high magical power. He knew that he needed a girl, and for this research he even carried out amputation of limbs. But because of this they do not live long. Agneil looked carefully in front of him, frowning his eyebrows, after which he clenched his jaw. He turned to Kuso. He asked him what. Agneil asked him that when he returned he would find him a child as usual. He said that it didn't matter to him at what price. With a tired expression on his face, he clarified that with a dark attribute or a light one, he doesn't care. The main thing for him is that she has great magical power. Kuso laughed in response to the fact that dark and light attributes are rare, after which he clarified that especially dark since the chance is 1 in 10,000. Agneil, with a serious expression on his face, ordered him in this case to go to another large shelter, after which he asked him, is this not a problem for him? Kuso looked ahead emotionlessly and answered him as he said. After that, he added that he was sure that he could find them at a cheap price. He said that as soon as he noticed someone, he would inform him. Agneil understood that the light and dark attribute were still quite useless, especially among slaves, but at the same time he understood that they could sometimes come in handy. He knew that people with dark attributes were too unpredictable and easier to get rid of, but the same could be said about people with light attributes. An image of light appeared in his mind, and he thought that it was a rare case when such a weakling was not expelled from the guild. He laughed and said that it was therefore especially pleasant to use it. He said that everything was thanks to her. At that moment, Seiya turned in his direction. Mentally he asked himself, is this true? At this moment he turned to Yami. He recalled that at first her face shone with trust, but over time, memories appeared in his mind of how he held her behind metal bars. She was dressed in rags, her face was dirty, and he fed her scraps that were not enough for normal food. Over time, step by step, her face became more and more distorted. He remembered how he pressed her head into the concrete floor with the sole of his shoe. He remembered that her face was distorted especially when he pushed her into the tank. He remembered how he roughly grabbed her by the hair and pushed her into the box. With tears in her eyes, she stretched her hands towards the light. Laughing loudly, he grabbed the staff with his hand. He raised his head up and triumphantly thought that it was difficult to count how many times he remembered this moment. He laughed like a complete madman. Seiya looked at him in fear, pressing her hand to her mouth. He gloatingly recalled the moment when he ignored human dignity. He confidently thought that he had the right to enjoy it. Without stopping his crazy laughter, he thought about all the humiliation that forced him to experience humanity. Holding the staff in his hands, he promised himself that he would take revenge on the world that was so unfair to him and, having accomplished his revenge, he would continue to live by managing it. Looking up with a crazy look, he asked, "Isn't that right?" At that moment he addressed his question to the world of fools. At this time, in a windless natural expanse, Yami peered into the landscape surrounding her. Light turned to her and asked her to come to him. Looking at her with a smile, he asked her to listen, after which he put his hand on her shoulder and said that he needed her to do something for him. He lowered his head to the level of her head and holding her shoulders with both hands said that he had only one request. After that, he turned his head to the side and told her to look. He said that there was a lake there. A few meters away from them, among a forest grove, there was a small azure-colored lake. With a serious expression on his face, he told her that she should wash there, after which he asked her if she understood. She looked at him in confusion. Without giving him an answer, he shouted to her that this was good. After that, he praised her, saying that she was great. He took her hand in his and invited her to go. When they approached the lake, he said with a smile on his face that it was shallow here, after which he said that everything was fine. He thought that he was not too sweaty and dirty, but Yami sat in that box for a long time. He put a small piece of soap in her hand and told her that it was soap. He thought that she smelled very bad. After that, he turned to Yami, who was hiding behind him, and asked her not to worry. He told her that he would turn away. Some time later, he was sitting behind 2 large stones with his head pointing towards the opposite side of the lake. Looking in front of him, he said that it was immediately clear that Agnil and the others were in a rank. He explained this by saying that the dry meat was surprisingly good. Holding this in his hands, he said that it could be used for cooking. Then he turned towards the lake, thinking that Yami had been gone for a long time. He asked Yami. After that, he asked her if she had finished. He was silent for a while and then asked in fear, "Yami?" He then began shouting her name loudly. He looked out from behind the stone he was sitting behind and asked himself, where did she come from? He said worriedly that he would just take a look. When he looked at the lake, he saw Yami sitting in clothes in the middle of the lake and holding soap in his hands. In bewilderment, he loudly asked her how to understand this. He himself asked himself incomprehensibly, why was she in clothes? He called out to her and asked where she came from. After that, approaching the lake, he said that in order to take a bath you need to undress, after which he asked her if she understood this. She looked at him emotionlessly and was silent in response. He asked himself in fear, is everything that bad? He took her by the sleeve of her robe and confusedly said that first she needed to undress, after which he asked her if she understood this. He shouted that these were her clothes. She looked down and said that it was not hers. He asked her again. She explained to him that if she takes it off, she won't see it again. After that, she put her hand on the collar of her robe. He explained to her that everything is in order now these clothes belong to her. With a smile on his face, he said that they would wash and clean it. Then he told her that she needed to wash herself. She looked at him carefully and then lowered her head. In response, he shouted to her, "Okay?" Some more time passed. He turned to her and asked if she had finished. Looking in front of him, he thought that she was silent again. He again looked out from behind the stone and shouted, "Yami?" He said that he would stop by a little more. Looking out from behind the stone, he asked himself in bewilderment, "What?" He saw her standing completely naked in the middle of the lake, with only her feet in the water. He asked himself in confusion, "Is she just standing there and looking at the butterflies?" He asked himself in fear, "Does she even understand how to wash herself?" After that, he asked himself, "How did she live then all this time?" Suddenly, Light remembered that her life took place in a tank. He sat down behind a stone and said to himself that he didn't want her to catch a cold. He understood that something had to be done, but on the other hand, she's a girl and he doesn't want her to think badly of him. But he sat behind a stone, looking tensely in front of him, after which he shouted to himself, "Okay." He decided that now he was a kind of father to her, although it was not easy for him to come to terms with this. He walked into her lake and confidently holding a rag in his hand shouted, "Okay." He shouted that he would wash it himself. He asked her not to think anything strange because he was only helping her because she looked like she couldn't do it herself. When he said this, he tried to look away and nod at her. Yami looked up at him in surprise. Then she asked him again, "Is he strange?" He tensely placed his hands on his head and loudly asked her not to repeat it again. In bewilderment, he wondered how it had come to this. After some time, he tied a bow on the robe she was wearing. She examined herself. Now she looked completely clean. Her hair was not as disheveled as before. With a smile on his face, he looked at her and invited her to hit the road and then take a break. After that, he asked her if she wanted to ride on his back. She began to negatively turn her head from side to side. He smiled widely, telling her to let him know if she got tired. He explained that he would always carry her on his back. The sun was setting and the sky was illuminated with golden light. A warlike goblin with red eyes, holding a club in his hands, jumped out of the bushes. Behind him there were several more goblins. Light and Yami looked towards them in surprise. Light instantly put out 2 of his fingers around which magical energy formed. He directed the beam towards one of the goblins and the head and hand separated from this body. Another goblin attacked him from behind in a jump. Light put his hand towards it. Then he directed a beam there. At that moment he was thinking about how many of them there are. He shouted in concern, turning to Yami, asking her to jump on his back. She stood emotionlessly in place without taking any action. He shouted in bewilderment, "Yami?" One of the goblins tried to attack her with his long claws while jumping. He asked her in fear what she was doing. The goblin, smiling widely, approached her closer and closer. She looked at it with a calm gaze. When the sharp claws of this one were centimeters from her face, Light, shouting her name, used a magic ray to tear the goblin's hand away from his body. After this, the bodies of the goblins were divided into many parts, from which the blue blood of these oozed. After a while, Light was squatting and Yami was lying on him. There were many goblin limbs and corpses lying around them. Light tried to regain his breathing, after which he turned to her and asked if she had heard him. Then he shouted that even goblins could kill her. She looked at him in surprise. He hugged her and said why. Suddenly he was interrupted as he heard hungry sounds coming from her stomach. He calmly closed his eyes and offered her something to eat, after which he said that it was almost night. He pointed with his hand to a large stone standing near them and said that they would make a camp in that place behind the rocks. He asked her to wait until he got ready. He then told her to tell her if she needed anything. Looking at her, he thought that she had lived locked up for a long time, and he did not blame her for not understanding some simple things. However, he thoughtfully asked himself, shouldn't there be a survival instinct? Thinking about this, he remembered the moment when the goblin almost tore her face with his claws. He looked at her thoughtfully and asked himself mentally, where did she come from? It got dark outside, and Yami and Light made a fire to cook food with it. They sat next to the fire, watching the already boiling food in the cauldron suspended above the fire. Sniffing the smell emanating from the food, Light asked if it was true that it smelled delicious. Yami looked at the cauldron in surprise, and Light, noticing this, said that it was called stew. Yami clumsily repeated this word, and Light, clarifying that this was a forest stew, noted that this was an unsurpassed dish prepared by a forest expert. He introduced several ingredients that went into the stew and explained that some of the leaves smelled like garlic and the roots became soft when cooked. There were also 5 types of herbs, and this time there were even more premium dried meats. Talking about the food he had prepared, Light closed his eyes, captivated by what was happening. While he was talking, everything was finally ready, and taking a spoon, Light, announcing this, promised that he would now highlight the most delicious thing for Yami. Yami felt embarrassed hearing this and lowered her head slightly before picking up a plate filled with fresh food. Light, having also served himself a portion, warned Yami to blow on the stew, as it was hot. Yami asked again in bewilderment, and Light showed how to do it, explaining that you need to blow on a spoon. Watching Yami try to blow on the stew to cool it down, Light guessed that it must be very tasty. Finally, Yami tried the food, and Light, noticing this, smiled and asked with interest how she liked it. Yami didn't answer, but simply smiled enthusiastically, and this made Light happy. He advised Yami to chew well, but she again did not respond, carried away by the absorption of food. After finishing the stew, Yami and Light made tea, and Light, calling out to Yami to get her attention, admitted that he wanted to get to know her better just a little. That is why, smiling benevolently so that Yami would not be scared, he asked if he could ask her a question. Yami nodded silently, and Light thanked her for that. First, he asked how old she was. Yami replied that she didn't know that, and Light asked if she had a last name. Yami didn't know the answer to this question either, and Light, who was already starting to get nervous, suggested that Yami could wield magic. Yami again didn't know how to answer, and Light asked if she knew where she lived. Without waiting for an answer, he assumed that she lived in an orphanage, promising that he would take her there when they returned to the city. Yami thought for a while, and then said that her house is a box. Light, frowning, cried out that the box was not a house, and asked if this was really the place where Yami lived before. Yami didn't know what to say to this, and fell silent again, remembering how Agniel, having greeted her, announced that from today she would live here. That is why now, with her head down, Yami said that the box was her home. Light was outraged and exclaimed that this was not true, and then, clenching his jaw, said Yami's name, suggesting that no one cared about her at all. Yami, not understanding why Light was reacting this way, looked at him in bewilderment, and he admitted to himself that he did not know what was happening to her. When he saw Yami while she was being attacked by a goblin, he thought it was a survival instinct, but now he assumed that it was not so. He asked if it was possible that Yami ended up in this situation because she didn't understand that her life mattered. Closing his eyes in irritation, Light frowned and, mentally turning to Agniel, asked why he was doing this to Yami. And suddenly a quiet sound attracted Light's attention, and he, widening his eyes, looked a little to the side, noticing that Yami, having fallen asleep, leaned her head against his shoulder. Watching Yami fall asleep, Light smiled, and then carefully removed the glass from her hands, placing Yami's head on his lap. He understood that it had been a difficult day, and looked up at the sky, and then lowered his head, unable to hold back the tears that welled up in his eyes. Having erased it with his hand, Light again mentally turned to Agniel, declaring that he would never forgive him. Even if Agniel returned to the capital tower or some other place where he decided to come, Light was going to take revenge on him, since Agniel made him a scapegoat, locked Yami in a tank, and when she was no longer useful, he simply threw her away. Light was definitely going to kill Agniel and did not want to retreat until he accomplished his plan. However, something made him doubt, and looking at the sleeping Yami, he thought, because he did not understand if he was arrested for this, what would happen to Yami? In his thoughts, he reproduced several images of her, realizing that in this case she would be left alone, not knowing how to survive, and if Light was lucky and Yami was taken to a shelter, then she could still be sold and harmed. Imagining the lonely Yami in a dark room, Light frowned, pursing his lips tightly, and added that it still seemed to him that such a thing was impossible, since there was no need for others to hurt Yami. Light knew that Agniel was a proud man, and therefore assumed that he was unlikely to bother an orphan like Yami. He thought that this would be the case, and now he understood that even if they came for him, he could defend himself, and, looking at the two fingers extended forward, Light activated his magic, collecting a small ball of concentrated energy next to his palm. If it was only Agniel, Light assumed that he could avoid punishment, and looked at Yami, who suddenly, stretching out her hand a little, grabbed Light's palm with her palm. He was very surprised to feel this touch, and, mentally turning to Yami, so as not to wake her up with his voice, he asked her not to worry, and also promised that he would not leave her alone. For some time he just sat silently, watching Yami, and then stroked her hair with his palm and promised that he would protect her, because thanks to her he was still alive. Thinking about this, Light closed his eyes and smiled with satisfaction. A little later, when the sun was shining brightly over the city, someone, entering one of the buildings, screamed. It was Kuso, who, frowning with displeasure, asked to be allowed to withdraw the money. He was unhappy while talking to his interlocutor and asked if this person knew who Kuso was. Meliza, as well as a number of other adventurers who were in the guild at that moment, watched Kuso in bewilderment and a little suspiciously, not understanding how else to react to this. Finally, Meliza, closing her eyes, lowered her head and said with regret that she did not remember all the faces. Kuso said that his badge was burned during the quest, and Meliza, holding several sheets of paper in her hands, said that in that case, Kuso should fill out this form, promising that they would reissue the documents in the coming days. Kuso screamed indignantly and warned that he did not have the money for this. Saying these words, he leaned forward, approaching Meliza, and she, frightened, screamed and closed her eyes, and Kuso, straightening up, spread his arms to the sides and, saying his name, asked if they really didn't believe him. Meliza, having calmed down, looked displeasedly at Kuso and noted that, if anything, we could say that he looks like a pervert. Kuso said that in this case he would show his holy scripture, and lifted the remaining unburnt part of the armor, showing his naked body. Meliza said that there was no need to do this, and, looking displeasedly at Kuso, she lowered her hand under the surface of the table, where 2 buttons were located. She was about to call the guards, but before she could press the button, she heard Kuso tell her to think and warned that he was here 4 days ago with the sage Agniel. Meliza thought about it and remembered that she had submitted the quest a few days ago. A piece of paper on which information on this quest was written. She fell asleep light, and now, remembering this, Meliza excitedly said his name. Kuso, hearing this, exclaimed that this was indeed so, recalling that he was there too. Melissa said that she still didn't remember this, and Kuso sighed in disappointment and lowered his head. Melissa added that Light is a different matter, since he is trusted by people. These words made Kuso clench his jaw in irritation and frown, and Melissa, not paying attention to such a reaction, closed her eyes and calmly said, "If Light can confirm Kuso's words, then they will give the money." Annoyed by the situation, Kuso slammed his fist onto the tabletop and declared that Light was dead. The adventurers, hearing this, again turned their attention to Kuso, and Meliza froze in shock, her mouth slightly open. Realizing the information Kuso said, she asked again, not understanding what he was talking about. Kuso reiterated that Light was dead, adding that he had been eaten by a lick. These words only frightened Meliza more, and she froze, and Kuso, taking advantage of this, snatched a sheet of paper from her hands, telling her to give it here. Meliza did not resist, but simply stood there, trembling, as she was unable to cope with the emotions that appeared after the announcement of Light's death. All this time, Kuso diligently filled out the documents, and then, having finished with this, he handed the sheets of paper to Melis, promising that he would come later. Meliza asked him to wait and asked if what Kuso just said was really true. Kuso stopped at first, listening to Melissa's question, but left, closing the door behind him when she asked if Light had died. A little later, an astonished cry was heard from the carriage in which Agniel and his team were riding. Agniel, frowning, asked if Kuso really couldn't withdraw the money. Kuso, spreading his arms to the sides, announced that they had no choice, and, moreover, the IDs were burned. Agniel asked what to do now. Kuso explained that he had applied for a reissue, but warned that it would take several days. That is why he decided that it would be better for them to immediately return to the capital. But Agniel, interrupting his words, angrily asked how he could return home in this form. Such a statement was due to the fact that Agniel was a great sage. Saya, clinging to Agniel, closed her eyes, began to cry, and shouted that she was also embarrassed. A little later, they calmed down when they heard Kuso declare that everything would be different if there was only one person here. Saya and Agniel did not understand who Kuso was talking about, and he said that the person he meant was Light. Saya and Agniel asked at the same time, not understanding what this meant, and Kuso, lowering his head, explained that, apparently, Light was trusted, so he could confirm Kuso's statement. Agniel didn't know how to react to this, and after a short silence, he asked if Kuso had said Agniel's name. Kuso confirmed this, but noted that the guild knew more about Light than Agniel. Agniel, clenching his palm into a fist, hit the wall of the carriage with it, angry that they knew more about Light than about himself. Kuso just sat there, and Agniel asked if everyone really trusted Light that much. In his thoughts, he called Light derogatory names, and also replied that he was just a dropout. With each passing moment, Agniel seemed to become more enraged and clenched his jaw more tightly, and Saya, hoping to calm him down, placed her palm on Agniel's shoulder, drawing his attention to her. She was scared, tears appeared in her eyes, but Agniel, not paying attention to this, simply seriously told them to sell the horse. Kuso was not going to argue with this, but warned that the market was closed now, so it would not be possible to sell at a high price. Agniel didn't care about this, and even if he had to live in a boarding house or something else, he was going to restore his magic and hunt monsters in order to earn money. If he arrived at the guild well-dressed and well-groomed, he was sure that they would change their minds, and if they didn't, he was going to do it by force. Frowning, Agniel clenched his hand into a fist, and Kuso simply sighed, not intending to argue further. Around the same time, Light, along with Yami, stopped on a small hill and looked at the city that appeared ahead. Smiling happily, Light asked Yami to look at it and warned that they would soon be in the city. Yami froze in shock. Her mouth parted in surprise and looked at the city ahead. A little later, Agniel, Kuso and Saya walked outside, walking embarrassedly through their tattered clothes. Some time passed, and seeing the gates of a large city, Light cried out, scratching his head with his palm, and said that he recognized the good old gate. It had been less than a week since they left, and now Light was happy to see familiar places. He remembered that he had to recover for several more days, and mentally noted that he had gone through such hell that had never happened in his life before. He remembered fighting with his hand over a wound and also developed light magic, which was said to be a useless attribute. Now, despite all the terrible things that happened, Light smiled, clenching his hand into a fist, and suddenly noticed that Yami was watching him in surprise and attentively. Tilting his head slightly to look at her, Light warned that they were about to enter the city and said that there were a lot of people there, but told Yami not to worry. He also announced that they would eat delicious food and sleep in a warm bed, and wanted to explain what she needed to do if she got scared. But before he could even say anything, Yami simply came closer and held his hand for his hand. Light was surprised, not expecting such actions, and looked at their joined hands. He had never had this before. But now, looking at the calm Yami, Light smiled and realized that he had someone to protect. He invited her to go and began to approach the gate. Eric and Karen, standing guard near the gate, froze in shock when they noticed Light and asked if it was really him. Light came closer with a smile and cried out joyfully when he recognized his comrades. He was surprised by the greeting with which he was greeted, and Eric and Karen asked if Light was really alive. Light was shocked when he heard this question and hesitantly said that he was still alive. Eric and Karen were delighted, and even almost cried with happiness, thinking that this was very good. In any case, having calmed down, they advised Light to go to the guild as soon as possible, and Light, still not understanding what was happening, looked at them in confusion, but Eric and Karen pushed Light in the back, telling him to just go. Even though he was shocked, Light still didn't argue anymore and walked towards the guild. At the same time, in the guild, the adventurers stood with sadly bowed heads and looked at the image of Light standing on the table. Closest to this table stood the priest, Meliza, and also another girl. Tears appeared in the corners of Meliza's eyes, and she lowered her head, not knowing what to say. Finally, the girl standing next to her warned that it was time to start, and Meliza did not argue with this. She noted that Light had no one left to take care of him, so they would have to give him a funeral. She could no longer hold back the tears, and it flowed down her cheeks, and Meliza closed her eyes to somehow try to stop the crying. She suddenly fell to her knees, placing her hands on the table, and, crying harder, admitted that she was very sorry for sending Light on this quest. The priest, amazed at Meliza's behavior, shouted her name, but Meliza did not pay attention to this and, continuing to cry, shouted that Light should not have died. She was sure that it was all because of her, and noted that she was very stupid. And at that moment, the door leading to the guild suddenly opened, and Light walked inside, who said that he was told to come to the guild as soon as possible. He looked genuinely scared and asked if he was going to be reprimanded or something. The adventurers, noticing Light, screamed in horror, and Meliza, trembling, raised her head. She shouted Light's name and, rising to her feet, ran towards him, about to hug him. He was amazed at this reaction, and a little later, when everyone had calmed down, he sat down at the table with Meliza and Yami, and Meliza said that she was told that Light had died. She remembered what Kuso had said about this, whom she called a naked man. Now she realized that it was a lie, and, frowning in anger, she remembered that Kuso had said that he was a member of Team Silver Will. Light didn't quite know what to answer, but in the end, after a short pause, he warned that he couldn't know exactly who it was, but he could guess roughly. In his thoughts, he said the name Kuso, and then, smiling, warned that he had left the group. He didn't have to explain everything to Meliza right now, and she, angry about the situation, decided that she should cancel the process of reissuing the badge for Kuso. And suddenly Light remembered something and asked if Melissa knew any good tool stores in the city. Melissa was surprised to hear this question and asked if Light only needed tools or something else. He smiled happily and explained that he was trying to sell something, clarify that these were body parts. He had never had any luck with monster items before, so he didn't know where to go. Melissa, hearing this, asked if Light really had these items. He confirmed this, noting that he was just lucky, and suggested that we talk about it later, since now he needs money. Looking at Yami sitting next to her, who was blowing on the contents of the glass in her hands, and Light explained that he needed the money for her. Melissa, looking at Yami with a smile and tenderness, admitted that she was very sorry that she was lost in the forest. Yami didn't answer, but simply started drinking, and Light agreed with Melissa's words. He felt bad for lying to her, but beyond that, it was hard to tell her everything that had happened. Finally, Melissa, putting her finger to her chin, said that there were several tool stores in the city, but admitted that she was not sure which of these stores would have the best prices. The adventurer, who listened to their conversation, suddenly screamed, realizing something, and asked what about the store in the alley. Melissa realized that this was a suitable option and warned that the owner there was a little strange, but noted that some stores pay more for some things than others. Light thought it was great, and Melissa closed her eyes, smiled and told him not to worry about what the building looked like, but to just stop by. Light was very surprised, but did not argue. A little later, together with Yami, he walked down the street, looking at the small piece of paper that was handed to him, and realized that, judging by the map, this task should be somewhere here. Taking a break from the road, he looked at Yami and said that soon she would eat a lot and tasty. Yami simply looked at Light in response, but did not say anything, and Light, returning to the route, realized that now he needed to turn into the alley and turn again. And suddenly he froze, eyes wide open, and was horrified by what the wooden house, decorated with skulls, looked like. He asked what kind of place this was. Now Light realized that he was a little worried. Continuing to look around the building, he read that on the sign it was written that this was an alchemist's shop with a wide range of products. Light didn't argue with the fact that it looked scary, but he suddenly remembered how Melissa warned him not to worry about what the building looked like. Not only she said this, but the rest of the guild members also advised coming here. In the end, Light decided that the first thing he needed was money, and, confident that he had to get it, he opened the door, awkwardly peering inside. The alchemist, who was lighting a special pipe, exhaled smoke into the air and, smiling, noted that Light and Yami had been standing near the store for a long time. She told them to come in already, and Light, freezing for a moment, asked if they had really seen him. He agreed that he needed to go in, and, going inside, he came closer to the table at which the alchemist was sitting. Looking around at his surroundings, Light admitted that it was a little strange since the goods here were quite average. In addition, turning his attention to the alchemist, he admitted that he could not understand whether it was a man or a woman. Finally, the alchemist, attracting Light's attention, asked if they really wanted to sell something. Light confirmed this and, placing his bag on the table, asked the alchemist to look at it. He didn't know if he could sell it all, so he decided to start with a large number of drops and see how it went. Opening the bag, he showed the contents of it, and then gradually began to place the items on the table in front of the alchemist, who carefully watched Light's actions. Yami also watched what was happening, and in the end, having laid out all the things, Light said that there were cores, bones and ashes of a large phantom. These were the core and bones of mana skeletons, so each of these could be sold for 10 coins, according to Light. But before he finished speaking, the alchemist suddenly trembled, dropping the pipe from her hands, and cried out in shock, asking where Light got this material. She was sure that it was a fake, but Light convinced her that the materials were real, explaining that he took it in the Lick's cave, in the boss's room. The alchemist asked again, still perplexed by the fact that there really was a Lick there. As she spoke these words, she leaned closer to Light, and he closed his eyes, feeling that he smelled of cigarettes. Finally, the alchemist, stepping back a little, asked what Light's attributes were. If he defeated the Lick, then, most likely, as the alchemist assumed, he was very strong. After a short pause, Light, awkwardly scratching his cheek with his finger, said that his attribute is light, and the alchemist, hearing this, laughed, shouting that this was excellent. She couldn't believe that the light attribute was a lick in the room, and while she continued to laugh, Yami, surprised by the new sound she heard, tried to repeat it, but Light, unhappy with this reaction, asked Yami to stop. Cursing, he realized that everyone was laughing at the attribute of light, and in the end the alchemist said that she could not count the number of people who had been there and returned, because it was impossible to win and return. Light agreed with this, and remembered that Agniel said something about ancient writings in which this was indicated. In the end, the alchemist simply sighed and said that this was well known in their circles, and that was why Light's lies would not work. Taking in her hands one of the cores brought by Light, the alchemist warned that you can find out whether it is a fake or not if you carry out the appropriate analysis. Light assumed that no one would believe him if he told about the laser, and said that he went with a group on a quest to find this lick. The alchemist, hearing this, asked again in bewilderment, since she did not understand why the rank team would take the light with them, and Light, smiling, explained that it had to be taken as a magical reservoir, and said that it had high magical power. The alchemist suddenly recognized Light, and he, amazed by this, asked if he was really famous. The alchemist, meanwhile, asked if this was an adventurer specializing in parasitism. Light was dissatisfied with this wording, but still agreed, thinking that so be it if the negotiations were successful. Without paying further attention to this, the alchemist announced that he would ask the last question, and asked if Light had a lick staff or robe. Yami, not paying attention to the conversation, looked a little to the side, noticing a skull standing on one of the shelves, and Light, meanwhile, asked again, paying special attention to the word robe. He announced that the group had a staff, and wanted to say about the robe, but did not have time to do so, because suddenly the alchemist screamed, while Yami picked up the skull. Suddenly running out from behind her desk, the alchemist took the skull from Yami and warned her not to touch it without permission. Yami did not answer, and the alchemist suddenly froze, smoothing out the clothes Yami was wearing in surprise. She recognized this fabric and, touching the clothing with her hand, froze. Light said that these were clothes that he sewed from scraps of fabric left over from the lick. The alchemist was silent for some time, and after that she announced that everything was clear to her, and, returning to her place, she promised that she would appreciate what Light offered. Regarding the robe, she explained that if the lick staff is a launcher for magic, then the robe is an amplifier of enormous power. Light was surprised to hear these words, and very soon he saw several gold coins on the table in front of him. The alchemist announced that there were 11 gold coins, noting that generally there should be 10 gold and 95 silver, but now she was making an exception. Light was amazed to see such a sum and screamed, his mouth wide open, and the alchemist, smiling, announced that their motto was that a good thing comes at a fair price. Light leaned away, picking up the money, and the alchemist warned him to beware of pickpockets. Light, walking towards the exit with Yami, said that now they can eat delicious food, but stopped when he heard the alchemist calling him. She asked if he had any other personal items. Light said that this was not the case, and the alchemist simply sat there, looking after him. When the door closed, she picked up her pipe, taking a drag, and, watching the curls of smoke floating in the air, she asked herself, could this really be true? She removed the hood from her head, asking if Light had done this with a weak light attribute. This made her frown, and now she couldn't just leave it like that. Sometime later, Light was walking next to the street stalls, holding Yami's hand. Yami looked around in surprise, and Light looked at the wallet he was holding in his hands. Now this wallet was filled with gold coins, and Light's hand was even shaking from all the emotions he was experiencing. There were 11 gold coins here, and Light had never had so much money in her life. It was only a small part, but his bag was still full and heavy. Clutching his hand tighter on the strap of his bag, Light turned to Yami and asked if she wanted to eat. Yami turned away from looking at the objects around her and looked at Light, and then asked if he was really talking about food. She looked first at one side, where sweet pastries were displayed on a shelf, and also at the other side. where, in addition to donuts, there were burgers and hot dogs. The sight of all this food delighted Yami, and she, unable to restrain herself, opened her mouth slightly, and drool flowed from her chin. Light understood everything and offered to eat it all. He clenched his palm into a fist and frowned confidently, and Yami, hearing Light's proposal, screamed joyfully, and they again joined hands, as they had previously separated their palms, and invited each other to go forward and go through all the counters. They sampled meat pita, top-quality kebabs, and plenty of crunchy barley sweetness. Yami and Light ate all this with great pleasure, and, having eaten, sat down. Light leaned back in his chair and, sighing, said that it was very tasty. Yami just sat there, washing down everything she had eaten, and Light, closing his eyes, said that all of this cost less than 1 silver coin. He was glad that Melissa introduced him to this beautiful place, even if it was a little strange. Thinking about this, Light remembered the situation in the store where he sold the items, and after that, opening his eyes, he suddenly heard in his head the voice of the alchemist, who asked if he had anything else from the lick. In fact, Light did have such items, which were a lick core, a lick robe, ash, as well as a dagger and other things that Light made for Yami. In addition, there was some fabric for the rope. But suddenly Light was distracted from his thoughts as he noticed that Yami was looking at him carefully. Smiling, he asked what happened. Yami pointed her finger forward, and Light, turning in the same direction, looked in surprise, trying to understand what Yami was pointing at. Finally, he saw shelves of baked goods, and Yami, who was looking at the shelves in admiration, said that it smelled good. Light laughed quietly and suggested that they continue their tour, rising from his chair. Yami was still sitting, not daring to get up, and Light invited her to go forward, and she, no longer doubting it, smiled joyfully, repeating Light's words. Light, seeing Yami's happiness, smiled contentedly, offering to buy Melis a souvenir and go to the guild when they had eaten enough. A little later, in the guild, even from outside, the cry of a man was heard, who announced that they needed money. Melissa, standing with a serious expression in front of Agniel and his team, showed him pieces of paper and asked them to fill out this form if they needed money. She warned that the registration takes about a week, and the payment is 1 gold coin. Agniel frowned and after a short pause, trying to lean forward, asked that in this case Melissa would give him a quest so that he could earn some money. Seiya, without saying anything, simply hugged Agniel's hand, excitedly watching what was happening. But Melissa said that she could not do what she asked Agniel to do, and he, hearing this, asked again in bewilderment. Seiya let go of his hand, also surprised by this, and Melissa explained that they would need ID in order to accept the quest. It was after this that she was gladly ready to provide the quest, and Agniel, looking at the calm expression on Melissa's face, clenched his teeth with such force that his lips began to tremble. Finally, he shouted that he was a great sage and repeated his title several times, warning that he was the leader of a strong group. Confirming his words, he pointed his hand towards Sai and Kuso. Kuso just stood there, the corners of his lips down sadly, and Seiya frowned in confusion. In the end, Melissa said that she had already heard about it, and Kuso, who understood what she meant by saying this, agreed. Agniel, not about to give up, said that he personally came here today and asked if Melissa remembered what happened a week ago. Melissa thought for a while, and then asked, "Where is Light?" who accompanied them, in this case. This question made Agniel freeze, frowning in confusion, and he recalled that they had already talked about Light being dead. Melissa frowned, pressing her lips tightly, and the adventurers who were in the guild and heard everything Agniel was saying laughed. Agniel, hearing this reaction, began to look around in amazement, asking himself what was happening here. He only frowned deeper, and Melissa suddenly asked seriously, "Doesn't Agniel know that false reporting to the guild is punishable?" She couldn't believe that he was a great sage, and Agniel simply swore, not knowing how else to convince Melis. At the same time, Light was approaching the guild and heard from the street how Agniel irritably asked how Melissa dares to talk to him like that. Light recognized his voice almost immediately. At the same moment, Agniel, tightly squeezing Melissa's wrist, shouted that Light had died and announced that he was not lying about this. Melissa was unable to resist and free her hand from Agnel's grip. But before anything terrible happened, a hand suddenly fell on Agnel's shoulder, and a man who came closer ordered Melissa to be released. Besides this person asked who died here. Agnel, suspecting something was wrong, frowned, and Seiya and Kuso froze, their mouths wide open in amazement. Slowly turning his head to the side, Agnel opened his eyes wider, and Light, frowning confidently, smiled, but did not remove his hand from his shoulder. The adventurers and Melissa smiled joyfully, but Seiya and Kuso, in contrast, experienced only horror. The same emotions were on the face of Agnel, who, frowning in bewilderment, asked if this was Light. Light, still smiling, noted that it looked like he had risen from the dead, and Agnel, stepping aside, threw Light's hand off his shoulder. He pursed his lips, and Seiya, frightened, hugged Agnel's hand, shouting his name. Agnel, not paying attention to this, called Light and asked how he did it. Kuso stood there in shock, his eyes wide open, and only became more frightened when he heard Agnel's words. Agnel, meanwhile, annoyedly shouted that Light could not survive, and wanted to say that they left him in the dungeon. But before he finished this phrase, Kuso extended his hand forward, interrupting Agnel's words. Leaning closer, he ordered him to stop, explaining that if it became known that Agnel was specifically using a guild member as bait, it would become a criminal offense. All the adventurers became wary, seeing Agnel and Kuso whispering, and Agnel, although he didn't say anything more, frowned deeper. Light asked what is it. In his opinion, Agnel probably had something to say, and he also added that Agnel could also talk to Yami. Yami came closer, and Agnel opened his mouth in horror, looking at how she approached Light, clutching a packed box in her hands. Kuso was also shocked, and Seiya asked who it was. Yami simply walked up to Melissa and handed her the gift, telling her what it was. Melissa, taking the box, laughed quietly and thanked Yami for this. Agnel suddenly smiled and understood what was going on, saying that it was now clear why Light returned alive after leaving them. Light's expression became more stern. He was no longer smiling, and Agnel said that even with the terrible Light attribute, Light still has an unlimited amount of magical powers. Immediately after that, he asked how it felt. Agnel hoped that Light was comfortable using his magic reservoir. Light frowned deeper, mentally noting that he had been by Yami's side for a long time to protect him from all troubles and adversity. Agnel, unlike Light, tried to kill her, and now, stretching his hand forward, he ordered Light to return Yami to him. Light thought about this for a long time, but did not say anything yet, but simply watched Agnel, who suggested that Yami was beginning to become human again. In his opinion, this was not the right thing to do, and these words caused Light to release his magical energy. A dim aura began to form around his body, and Agnel said that there could be no humanity in the instrument. While he was saying these words, Light remembered how Yami, on her own initiative, took his hand, and Agnel, meanwhile, added that the instrument does not need a heart. Light knew that everything would happen like this, and now he leaned forward a little, unable to contain the magical energy emanating from him. Other adventurers who were in the guild building noticed this and asked in bewilderment what it was. From how strong the concentration of magic was, even the glasses standing on the tables began to shake, and someone suggested that it could be an earthquake. Light, not paying attention to these words, called out to Melissa and, hearing that she responded, asked her to take care of Yami. Melissa was surprised, but still asked Yami to go behind the counter. Kuso, sweating a little with excitement, looked up and asked in bewilderment, "What is this?" Melissa, meanwhile, sat down at the counter next to Yami and asked her to stay here, and Light seriously looked a little to the side. Agnel, seeing this, grinned and asked if Light was really thinking of threatening him. Light simply raised his hand, concentrating the magical energy, and after that he put 2 fingers forward, and next to this a bright flash appeared, aimed at Agnel. Gradually, the magical sphere at the ends of Light's fingers increased, and Kuso, noticing this, excitedly said the name Agnel, but was unable to say anything else. The adventurers were horrified, but Agnel, calling Light a non-entity, asked what he could do to him with this useless attribute. He grinned, and Light admitted that he was right. but added that he had to disappoint him, since he no longer wielded light. Besides this, Light wanted to say something else, and, continuing to hold his fingers in Agniel's direction, he warned that he would never forgive him. Agniel continued to grin, but no longer looked so self-confident. Melissa watched what was happening in fear, and Yami, peeking out from behind the counter, also looked at Light, who angrily announced that Agniel should receive it. He activated his laser, and a bright beam flew towards Agniel, who froze in shock. With an enraged expression on his face, furrowing his eyebrows and opening his mouth wide, Light shouted for Agniel to get it. After that, he gave a loud command shouting, "Laser!" After his order, a bright flash illuminated the Guild of Travelers. A huge luminous ball appeared in front of the faces of Agniel, Sai and Kuso. A wide beam pierced right through the wall of the Travelers Guild. The townspeople who were outside it ran away to the opposite side with frightened expressions on their faces. The men inside the guild looked ahead in fear. The Melissa, with its eyes and mouth wide open, hid behind the wooden counter. After that, all the dust that was in the Travelers Guild rose into the air. Kuso rested his hand on the floor and made a painful sound. While the people inside were screaming, Light looked down with a confident expression on his face. He raised his hands up, and in front of him on the ground sat Agniel, who was squeezing his head with his hands. He looked down in bewilderment and asked himself again. He then raised his head in rage and asked what he had done. His voluminous hairstyle consisting of his blonde hair has changed somewhat. Now there was a wide line running exactly down the center of his skull, exposing his skull. All the hair in the middle of his head was burned off along with the skin on his skull. He looked ahead with anger. The male travelers and Melissa watched this with wide smiles on their faces. Saya grabbed her head in horror and screamed in fear. "Oh no!" She raised her head up and screamed in hysterics, turning to Rot, his head. Kuso at this moment could hardly contain his laughter by covering his mouth with his hand. Agniel asked in surprise, "Head?" After that, he began to feel his head. He touched the place where the hair and skin on his head were burned, after which he made a loud questioning sound. Light, with a straight face, said that he had thinned it out a bit. Agniel looked at him in rage and shouted, calling him a nonentity. Sayer ran up to Agniel and hugged him by the hand and began to swear in Light as if she were not a fragile girl, but an uncultured shoemaker. She called him names very rudely, calling him a fool with a worthless attribute. After that, she angrily asked him why he didn't die. She screamed hysterically that she had to make sure that the lick killed him. Then she, with a red face and tears in her eyes, wished him to die. She called him a stupid nonentity. Light calmly turned to her and told her to show at least a little remorse. They asked him again. After this, Light turned to Agniel and asked him if he was going to apologize to him and Yami. Agniel laughed and pointed his finger in his face and asked why he would do this. Agniel looked at him imperiously and shouted that he had turned them into useful tools. Then he shouted that they should be grateful to him. Light looked at him gloomily and said that he saw that he had no remorse. Kuso looked at him in horror. Drops of sweat were running down his face. He said in confusion that this was a nightmare and then hesitantly offered Light to pray for him. Light abruptly interrupted him and said that he was not talking to him, after which he called him a child lover. Kuso fearfully began to press himself into the floor, trying to answer him something. Light confidently put his fingers in front of him. Magical sparks began to emanate from these. He asked, "Next time he will be honest with him?" After that, he turned askance to Agniel. Then the three of them put their hands in front of them and shouted, "Barrier." After that, a transparent blue wall consisting of many parts appeared in front of them. Agniel, standing behind this wall, said that even with the increased attack power, he still has the useless attribute of light. With a smile on his face, he shouted that he couldn't break through this. He explained his statement by saying that the magical protection of this is equal to 3,000. Light, not perceiving his words, instantly directed his incinerating beam in their direction. The beam did not even feel the impact of this barrier and penetrated it without any resistance. The barrier split into many blue pieces and scattered in different directions. Agniel, Kuso, and Saya looked at this in fear. A few moments after this, the three of them were lying on the floor. Their bodies were shrouded in fire. They were somersaulting on the floor trying to knock off the flames. They made loud screams of pain and fear. Kyuso screamed, "Fire!" Light defiantly blew on his fingers, from which steam was emanating, after which he asked them again, 3,000. He looked at them with a calm expression on his face and said that his laser had 100,000. Melissa looked at him in fear and addressed him by name. At this moment, the rotten one ran away in frenzied fear, crawling on its knees in the direction opposite to the light one. Light grabbed him by the scorched skull with his hand, after which he began to violently pound his face into the concrete floor. Agneil, with a bleeding lip and swollen veins on his face, looked at him furiously and began to scold him, asking if he knew who he was dealing with. The men in the guild looked at this in surprise with their eyes and mouths wide open. Light, looking confidently in front of him, told him, of course. After that he said that he humiliates others and lowers them to the status of a slave because he grabbed him by the collar of his clothes and pulled him towards him, after which he raised his fist above his head and said that all this was because he was the worst person in the world. Immediately after these words, he hit him right in the jaw with a heavy blow of his fist. A bloody splash flew out of Agneil's mouth. After that, he tried to hit him in response, but Light quickly reacted and dodged his blow, simultaneously striking him in the torso. Seiya looked at this in horror. Tears flowed from her eyes, and she pressed her hands to her mouth. Kyuso at this time turned away worriedly and was about to walk away. Light pointed his finger at him in rage and shouted at him not to run away, after which he called him a non-entity. At this time they were talking to him from behind, but he did not hear it. He pointed his finger at the Kyuso sitting scared near the wall. He shouted to him that he was next. After that, he loudly called him a terrible child lover. They turned to him again and again from behind, calling his name, after which the Melizar ran up to him and poured water from a bucket on him, shouting for him to listen to her. Light stood confused, drops of water dripping from his clothes. He turned around in surprise and asked, "Melissa?" She turned to the side and addressing the men who were in the guild as gentlemen, she said that they needed their help. She ordered them to take these three into custody and take them away. The men looked at her joyfully and shouted to her, "Of course." Soon after, they roughly grabbed Sai, Kyuso, Agneil. One of the men unsuccessfully tried to grab the Kyuso by its missing hair. The three of them tried to resist and ordered the man who grabbed him to leave him. Seiya menacingly asked what he was doing. One of the men grabbed Agneil by the shoulder by the scorched skull and menacingly ordered him not to twitch. After that he called him a non-entity. They took them away. One of the men told him to go faster. Light looked after them thoughtfully. He thought that he would really like to beat them with his own hands. At that moment he clenched his hand into a fist. He thought about how he would like to beat them until they confessed to their crimes. Suddenly he looked to the side and asked Yami if she was okay. She walked up to him and looked up at him with her big surprised eyes. With a smile, he looked at her and told her that it was all over. He thought that at least he hoped so. She smiled looking at him, and then they extended their hands to each other. Light understood that it was time to bring them to justice. He didn't have time to come to an agreement because someone's hand suddenly grabbed his wrist. He turned to the side. It was Melissa who turned to him with a smile on her face and told him that he did too. A few moments after this, two men grabbed him by the shoulders. He looked ahead in bewilderment and asked why him. 5 days later, in the wall of the Travelers' Guild building, there were 2 large holes from the rays that were created by light. He lay face down on a wooden table with a lost expression on his face and said why he was doing this. Yami was sitting next to him on a wooden chair and told him that he had been hit. He looked at her and said her name, after which he asked her if she had gained weight. After he asked the question, she, with the same expression on her face, hit him on the back of the head with her small fist. He screamed in surprise. She explained to him that this was not true. Light thought that Melissa should not have done this, but Agneil and the others deserved it. He realized that he had just fired 2 lasers with all his might, which caused 2 large holes to form in the wall of the guild. He and I walked past these. He understood that it was obvious that the guards immediately began interrogating him. He remembered how the terrible guard, looking down at him, shouted that he was lucky that no one died. Light then humbly apologized to him. He recalled that his right hand hurt so much from writing all the reports and other things that he didn't have time to notice how he rotted and the others were released. However, he also managed to free himself. He and I sat in the establishment at a wooden table and thought that for the big hole we had to pay 38 gold coins. However, he could have paid with what he had left from the cave, but fortunately he had money. At that moment, a woman's hand placed a plate in front of him on which there was a meat steak. It was Melissa who shouted that this was a rank lunch. He looked at her in surprise. After that, she handed the tray to Yami and said that she had a rank B lunch. Then she sat down at the table with them and laughed and said that she had a lot of work today. Light thanked her for looking after her. Melissa, with a smile on her face, told him that everything was fine, after which she said that Yami was a good girl, even taking into account the fact that her guardian had committed a crime. Light said shyly to himself, "Crime." Melissa put the paper on the table and said that while talking about her, she asked him to fill out this form later. He looked at this sheet in surprise and asked her, "What?" After that, he read that this was a guardian registration form. Melissa, putting her hand in front of her, said that he had taken custody of her. He agreed with this. After that he wanted to say something else, but she interrupted him and said that she checked to see if she was looking for stray children in the area, and she even looked in shelters. Light, looking worriedly at the sheet, thought that this was really so. He remembered that he had not told her the truth. Melissa, with a worried expression on her face, said that she checked the register of slaves, but there was nothing there either. Light understood that slaves are very expensive, and this is an official product that must be registered by the state since a tax is levied on it. He also understood that it was obvious that they had to fight to get them through. He remembered the image of Kuso who looked in front of him with a sly smile. Mentally, he called him a non-entity who knows his business. He understood that it turned out that Yami, according to the papers, did not exist in this world. He silently looked ahead. After this, Melissa said that, however, when such children appear, they are sent to an orphanage. Light shouted loudly, "No." After that, with his mouth wide open, he said, "Not to the shelter." She laughed looking at him and asked him not to worry. Looking at Yami, who was deliciously eating meat, Melissa said that she loved him very much. He looked at her in surprise and asked what. Melissa, with a smile on her face, said that every day she looks out the window in the direction in which he leaves. She said that of course this happens except for those moments when she eats. He looked in front of him in great surprise, after which he turned towards Yami and addressed her by name. She, without stopping to eat food, told him that this was not true. Then she looked at him, her cheeks covered in food crumbs. He looked at her with a smile and held out his plate to her, telling her to hold his portion. She joyfully raised her fist up and let out a triumphant cry. Melissa raised her finger up and said that that's why she came up with another option, after which she said that since he is a full-fledged member of the guild with completed quests, he can become her guardian. Light looked at her in shock and thought that he was Yami's guardian. Melissa added saying that it would cost a lot of money and she would have to take it with her everywhere, after which she asked him what he would say to this. He thought that his life had never been so joyful. This time she gave him strength. He remembered how they first met and realized that she saved his life. When he thought about it, he remembered how she bandaged his wounds. He understood that he had done nothing for